Sup you Sinister folks, welcome to the part 7, of What If Deku's Cursed Blood, Could You Know Reverse Death, Chapter 19 A Sinister Trial. Ikaruga, better known to the underworld of Japan as the Trinity Raven, was in no way having a good time. What started as an easy and quick contract on Friday had turned into a mess and a half of a headache. How her assignment of supervising a handful of greenhorn Yakuza brats through their first enforcing, only intervening if strictly necessary, had turned into yet another trip to the Mujudafu police station was beyond her. Honestly, educating the runts on proper cleanup should have been the hardest part of the job. Unfortunately for her, it turned out that their victims had been nothing like the shit scouts had reported. Granted, she'd expected the girl to give the brats a bit of a fight thanks to her position as a small-time gang leader, but the ferocity their main target had displayed had completely blindsided her. Surely anyone with the skill to mow down a small mob in under 2 minutes would have been someone she knew of, but the grease and oil-covered Riji Nikaido had proven himself to have been a highly volatile unknown variable. She hated when she was forced to step in, especially when the job was supposed to be an easy one for her. It had been her quirk that had saved her. The ability to conceal foreign objects using her body alone had always been Ikaruga's ace, even before she'd taken her first steps into the illustrious occupation of fixer. When taken in her slight frame, no one ever suspected she carried a veritable armory on her person at all times. Neither law enforcement nor her victims had ever realized the truth of the beauty marks that littered her body. And for obvious reasons, no one ever looked at them too closely, let alone touched them. There was one negative to her quirk, however. She was the favorite choice when a prospective client needed to clean up their bloody messes. She abhorred getting dirty. In the end, her ability hadn't been enough though. While it was true the father and daughter duo had been killed, the former by her own hand and the latter by an engine block dropping on her head, the job was ultimately a failure. Even a silver tongue like herself couldn't spin the situation to her benefit when all the idiots she had been hired to babysit ended up dead. But the crux of her problems this time, and what made matters worse, was that she hadn't had time to properly sanitize the scene before she'd had to flee. Just as she'd gotten the last of her bloodlust under control, she'd begun to hear far too much activity much too close for comfort. For the first time in her career, she, Ikaruga, the Trinity Raven, had been forced to leave behind used shells and discarded magazines for the law to find. The only saving grace was that she'd been able to conceal the bodies of the useless shits she'd been supervising. Even that wasn't a complete victory, as just the thought of the corpses sitting on her skin made her feel dirty. And she had to keep the stiffs on her until Monday, the earliest that Yakuza brat who'd hired her would agree to meet her. The paranoid shit was convinced moving any earlier would lead to him being traced. Luckily for him, he'd realized his demand entailed additional compensation, though in reality it'd be all she'd realistically receive since the primary job had fallen through. Ikaruga internally grumbled at the very thought. Such a paltry sum wouldn't even cover the cost of restocking the ammunition she'd used. Who would have thought that a mechanic, a fat one at that, would have been that hard to hit? Even ditching one of her Uzi and pulling out her execution pistol hadn't helped. In the end, it had taken distracting the bastard by aiming at the downed blonde girl for her target to hold still long enough for her to put a bullet in him. That alone hurt her pride. "I hate sloppy jobs," Ikaruga muttered, keeping her voice as low as possible. Even her general disposition of confidence was unable to keep her emotions completely bottled up, at the moment. Only the knowledge that she couldn't afford to screw things up further allowed the pinkette to focus and keep her cool. She hadn't even been able to leave her signature. At least, not in the elegant form she preferred. One given the privilege of dying as her target deserved a tasteful death, not the vulgar sham she'd been forced to make do with earlier. With one shot to the heart, for a confirmed kill, a second to a lung, and a third to the liver, the mark of the Trinity Raven was a masterpiece that signaled a perfectly completed job by a legend. The longer she mulled over her current situation, the more Ikaruga compared it to the fiasco that had become her hunt for that fuck toy the Yakuza had once allowed to escape. At least she was familiar with where she was at the moment. The Mujurafu police station's interrogation room? She could have laughed. The Pinkette had graced the drab chamber countless times in the past. Her perchance for appearing at the scenes of her work's aftermath had always been a planned advertisement of her services to Japan's underworld. Nothing could ever be pinned on her, no matter how obvious her involvement might have been, and every time she'd been taken away, she'd just appear the next day, free as a bird. The Trinity Raven had easily become known as the one to hire when you wanted no witnesses and no evidence, and then repeat service. And today would be no different. The interrogation room's door opened, and the annoying detective Ikuruga had been jerking around for a few years entered. Like she'd thought, this time would be no. The detective held the door open. "Midoriya-san, may I introduce you to Ikuruga, the Trinity Raven," the detective said, only making the Pinkette smirk. Bringing in someone new was also a tactic the police had tried before. But just as back then, it wouldn't do them any good now. Ikuruga's olive gaze stared flatly at the green-haired teen that walked in, round sunglasses reflecting the fluorescent glare from the lights above them. The newbie looked somewhat familiar. "Must you insist on that strange name, detective?" Ikuruga asked, voice pitched in mock hurt. The slightest quirk of one of her thin eyebrows was the only hint the woman was finding pleasure in continuing their farcical dance. "Honestly, you make it sound as if you think I'm some famous killer or something." Right as the Pinkette prepared her usual comeback to the detective's aggravated response, two more newcomers entered the room. Taking in the appearances of this latest duo, Ikuruga felt her stomach plummet. Impossible. Before the normally unflappable underworld cleaner stood two of her marks. Two marks that the Pinkette had been sure only moments ago had been properly dealt with. Even if the first had somehow survived an engine block to the head, there was no way she could have recovered from such a wound so quickly. The second. She'd ensured her death. She'd unloaded every bullet she'd had on her at the time into the girl after all. And yet, here they both stood, glaring at her with crimson eyes burning with vindication. "What's up, bitch?" the blonde girl with colored highlights greeted, an evil smile pulling at her pale cheeks. Ikuruga needed no further prompting. There were two witnesses to her work in the room, likely three. The green-haired brat had to have been the one the Pinkette had thought she'd taken care of the night she'd caught up with the runaway fucktoy. If her signature 3 shots hadn't killed him, he was probably some kind of healer, which explained. Not enough. And the damn detective was now smiling like a cat that had gotten the cream. Ikuruga knew at that moment she was out of options. She'd have to kill everyone in the room. Now. She could worry about fleeing the country later. Ikuruga. Trinity Raven. Tsukaki said, barely containing the smugness that was threatening his professionalism. These three are. Bang. Bang. The detective's introduction was cut, short as the Pinkette he thought was unarmed and cuffed to his interrogation table suddenly shot to her feet, pulled a high-caliber pistol out of nothing, and opened fire. Bang. 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 In a move too quick for Tsukaki to follow, Izuku tackled the detective to the ground. In that same instant, Tae shot across the room and reached for the hands of the woman who dared endanger the life of her master. Snap. Ga-na-ah. The blood-curdling scream that tore from Ikuruga's mouth, followed by a steady stream of expletive-heavy whimperings, left the room in near silence as the only other living occupants desperately tried to take stock of the situation. Managing to gather himself just a few seconds quicker than his intern, Tsukaki compartmentalized how close he'd come to death and sat up. Pulling the green-haired necromancer under his care up with him, the detective took stock of the room. The most shocking detail he noticed was that the now verified assassin Ikuruga was sniveling and thrashing around while held in place by the undead Rathed M. The Pinkette was being contained by gratuitous force being applied to her. Now clearly broken arms. Jagged bone protruded from her forearms provided a gruesome indication of the strength of those under the influence of his intern's quirk. "Are you alright, Tsukaki-san?" Izuku asked over the noise of the captive assassin. The green-haired teen was unable to mask his concern, worried out of his mind that he'd managed to fail twice in one day. "I'm alright," Tsukaki replied, patting himself down when he felt no sharp pains of a gunshot wound. "How about?" The detective's own concern died on his lips as the man finally noticed the bullet hole in his intern, right below the green-haired teen's armpit. Tsukaki blinked at the sight, unable to process firstly that the teen under his care had been hurt and secondly that there was far too little blood coming from the wound for its size. The man's shock turned to horror as Izuku literally spat out a bullet as if it were nothing. "I'll be fine," the green-haired necromancer said easily, as if he hadn't just been shot. Cringing at the coppery taste left on his tongue, Izuku turned to the undead in the room. "Tae-chan, Nikaido-san. How are you two holding up?" The growling Tae paused in manhandling the now terrified assassin to stare unblinkingly at her master. After a moment, Izuku's first partner cocked her head to the side. When the green-haired teen smiled gently in return, the Ravnet turned back to Pinkette she'd captured, growling once more. Saki merely poked at a new hole in her chest, reluctantly impressed at her foe's skill. "The cunt managed to nail me right in the heart," the blonde replied, "nothing serious, all things considered." Taking a moment to savor the feeling of invincibility flooding her as she watched the wound slowly close, Saki turned to the green bin that had brought her back to life. Another wicked grin spread across her face. "Wonder Girl here seems about ready to rip into the bitch," the rebellious zombie girl said. "Can you tell her to leave some for me?" Izuku briefly considered the request. His heart still beat like a war drum, adrenaline and the itch for vengeance pounding in his ears. But, more importantly, there was a promise he'd been unable to keep until now. He felt a dire need to bring justice to Tai, and all the other girls out there who had suffered like she had. The animal in front of him had murdered an untold amount of people, and her sentence would not begin here. "Not yet," Izuku decreed, halting Tai's growls and bringing a questioning glare to Saki's eyes. "First, we need a confession." The green-haired necromancer had quickly realized that a simple end for the Pinkette wouldn't be enough, not by a long shot. Instead, having the assassin guide the police to all of her clients, bringing down each and every scumbag and abhorrent beast that believed themselves untouchable would be a much more fitting punishment. As a bonus, they might even be able to rescue those who still had a chance. "Well, with what she did just now, we kind of have carte blanche with her at the moment," Tsukaki revealed, dusting himself off. "We really don't need anything else for a trial, but additional information never her. She killed Tae-chan." Izuku suddenly interrupted, subconsciously directing his blood to consume the epinephrine he could feel his body producing. The green-haired teen didn't want his anger to show in front of the detective if he could help it. That means she might be connected to some of the same people that hurt Lily-chan. Blinking at the sight of his intern struggling to contain his emotions, Tsukaki sighed regretfully as he placed a hand on the young necromancer's shoulder. "Midraya-san," the detective said, gaining the green-haired teen's attention. "That kind of information usually only comes about by making a plea deal." At first, Izuku gave no reaction to Tsukaki's words, and the man briefly considered repeating himself. Then the young necromancer tensed, and the detective felt a chill creep down his spine as the green-haired teen turned to him with a smile. "Tsukaki-san, forgive me if this is pushing things too far, but..." Izuku paused, appreciating the sight of Ikaruga still flailing helplessly in Tai's grip, desperate for escape. "Would making use of my blood as a truth serum of sorts be admissible? We have to heal her anyway, right?" The silence that followed weighed down heavily on the living occupants of the room like the inevitability of the grave. Even Ikaruga fell silent, her face now twisted in horror in addition to the blinding agony she felt. The Pinkette was no fool, she knew that quirks of such power weren't unheard of. She also knew that the precedents for the use of such quirks had long ago been established in Japan's justice system. As long as the brat's quirk was legitimate, then any information coerced from her lips would be valid. Worse, it sounded as if the evidence of her treatment would be erased as well, leaving her no way to defend herself in court. It should be possible. Tsukaki murmured, mentally going over the laws, protocols, and other legalities of such a tactic. Everything would have to be recorded, of course. And, once you give the approved orders, you'd have to leave the room. For impartiality's sake. The fact that the detective didn't immediately discount the green-haired monster's question, and even outlined how they'd go about implementing it, was akin to a death sentence in Ikaruga's eyes. The Pinkette shuddered. Betraying one's clients, coerced or not, always ensured the offending party met a messy, and oftentimes, nightmarish, end. Understood, Izuku replied after giving some thought to the detective's words. It made sense that he wouldn't be allowed to sit in on an interrogation that used an aspect of his quirk. The police had to prevent any chances of the biased confession of defense coming into play. Nodding, the green-haired teen looked to Tai and Saki. Bring her here. Crimson eyes now glowing scarlet, Tai began to drag the Pinkette she held back to the interrogation table. Ikaruga renewed her struggles, ignoring the searing pain shooting through her shattered arms. Her wild thrashing managed to get one of her legs in a position to strike at the undead Rathed M. Kicking out, the panicking assassin only landed 3 weak hits before Saki, eyes also aglow, caught the offending limb. Crack. Gah! Ikaruga screamed again, a fresh wave of pain coursing through her body. Her now broken knee could no longer support her weight, and the Pinkette sagged as she was manhandled. With no further resistance, Tai roughly shoved the quivering assassin back into her chair. You can't do this. Ikaruga forced out through teeth grit in pain and fear. I have rights. The Pinkette couldn't process what was happening. She'd been told, and confirmed, that the runaway fucktoy had been a quirkless weakling. Anyone should have been able to push her around, and often had by all accounts. But now the Rathed M was some kind of hulking behemoth wrapped in a petite package, an unstoppable force. And the mongrel wasn't that far behind in freakishness either. Leader of her own gang or not, reports had stated that the blonde's quirk dealt with machinery, not anything that could break bones like they were twigs. She hadn't shown this strength when she'd apparently failed to kill her either. Then the assassin noticed it. There was a small hole in the shirt the blonde half-breed wore, right at chest level. A bullet hole if she'd ever seen one. So she hadn't missed. Abruptly, the night she'd been forced to hunt down the fucktoy flashed before Ikaruga's eyes again. She remembered executing the brat who'd thought himself a hero with her signature 3 shots. She remembered unloading all of her frustrations on the runaway, 2 whole clips worth. The blood that had leaked from the brat had shown his quirk wasn't being bulletproof, and the quirkless fucktoy had been left at death's door on purpose, to suffer before meeting her end. As the memories faded, Ikaruga's mind flittered to the words of her contact at the local hospital. The mongrel had been declared dead overnight, unable to recover from the head wound the engine block had caused. And yet, all 3 were here, mind the glass. Wham! The sudden warning came a second before Ikaruga felt a hand grab her by the back of the head and slam her face into the desk she'd been forced to sit at. The force of the blow was enough to break her nose and crack the teeth at the front of her mouth. Dazed, the assassin hazily thought on how no glass had been involved. Perhaps that had been a joke? Ugh! Ikaruga groaned, the room beginning to spin. Weakly pushing against the hand holding her head down, the Pinkette managed to turn just enough to see the culprit of her latest pain. A brief surge of fury lit through the caught assassin when she realized it had been the mongrel that had slammed her down. Then the door to the interrogation room opened, and a small girl with blue pigtails entered holding a small box in her hands. Lily was glad that she could now enter the room her big brother had gone into. Previously, he'd ordered her to stay outside until he knew the situation was under control. If anything had gone wrong, she might have been targeted as the easiest to take hostage. When the littlest zombie had felt a tug in her chest after a number of minutes, she'd guessed her big brother had gotten a handle on everything. Feeling that she could enter the room on her own accord, the brunette unthinkingly brought her big brother's special med kit along with her. To those still among the living in the room, The sight of Lily Hoshikawa walking into the interrogation room with scarlet eyes aglow was enough to freeze them once again. It seemed Izuku's blood was quite potent, if one of those under control could tell when he needed them before the teen himself did. Thank you, Lily-chan," Izuku started, shaking off the off-putting sight of Lily's eyes glowing. He hadn't given her an order besides wait for him recently, had he? Graciously taking the medkit, the green-haired teen gave his cute assistant a loving head pat. "Now, let's help Miss Villain here feel more at ease with aiding the side of justice for once." Ikaruga, known far and wide in the underworld as the feared assassin Trinity Raven, watched on in muted horror and dread as the brat she'd long ago discounted took a small syringe from the box he'd been handed, and plunged the needle into the crook of his arm. With both of her arms, a leg, and her nose broken, not to mention two inhumanly powerful girls holding her down, the pinkette had no choice but to stare as the green-haired monster stepped towards her with the now blood-filled syringe. Looking up from her lowered position bent over the table, Ikaruga suddenly gasped. With the room's fluorescent light behind him, the figure coming at her was cast in silhouette. Mostly. Somehow, someway, red eyes blazed through the shadow, twin moons of avenging scarlet. Below, a frighteningly white smile carved through the dark form as well. For the rest of her days, the pinkette would never forget the nightmarish sight as it approached her. Nor would the words it spoke ever leave her. "Despise me, forgive me, resign yourself." Later, Police HQ rest area. Izuku, Tae, and Lily sat as comfortably as possible in the small corner of the police headquarters that served as the rest area for those waiting. The space came equipped with a coffee machine, which Izuku had made use of, and donuts that had been delivered by a younger officer only a few minutes ago. Lily had found the presence of the snack hilarious. "This has been," Izuku began, taking a sip from his mug of fresh coffee, "a rough day." Tsukaki had ordered the green-haired teen, and his two official partners, to leave the room shortly after his blood had taken hold in Ikaruga's body. The detective had kindly suggested that the three take a well-deserved break while he worked over the assassin. Saki had been asked to remain behind, a temporary security guard in the unlikely case that the pinkette broke free from the effects of control or it burned out sooner than expected. While they waited, Izuku wondered if using his blood like this would be cleared in the future for further use. Although the young necromancer still felt ill at ease using his quirk forcibly on others, if it was for the benefit of all, for justice, he supposed he could learn to live with it. Gra-ah-ha. Tae's groan, almost questioning in tone, earned a wince from the introspective hero in training. Lily agrees. Telling Inka Mama might not be a good idea, Lily added, throwing her own 2 yen in on the matter. Turning her focus to the pink icing-covered donut in her hands, the littlest zombie took a cute bite of the sugary treat. Izuku sighed. Lily had a point. His mother didn't need any more stress or shock in her life if he could help it. Not to mention he'd really rather avoid another reprimand from her as well. Yeah. The young necromancer conceded, not mentioning the bullets is probably for the best. Tae nodded, slowly as she bit into her own donut, chocolate icing with sprinkles. While neither zombie girl truly needed to eat food, it had seemed rude to Izuku to reject the treats when the young officer had offered. The green-haired teen might have felt differently if he'd known the gifts had only been purchased in the mistaken belief that they'd be enough to keep his undead partners pacified and too full to consider biting humans. "Hey. So I heard Otsukaki actually came to work today," Izuku heard one of the officers sitting at a bullpen around the corner say. Only half paying attention due to the inclusion of the detective in the discussion, the green-haired teen took a sip of his coffee as he listened in. "That's kind of unusual. It's that time of the month, right? What, you think he had a fight with his old lady or something?" Izuku forced himself to swallow instead of spit up his coffee. What was he listening to? The young necromancer didn't know what to do. On one hand, it was hard for him to think of a man as dedicated to his work as the detective as being married. On the other, It made sense that such dedication would cause a fight considering the workload any case potentially involving Seal would generate. Suddenly, Izuku felt righteous indignation for Tsukaki. Surely the man wanted to be able to spend more time with his family. He didn't need his co-workers talking behind his back. Nah, I think he just had some high-profile case or something came up. All that hero liaison shit he does, you know? Another officer replied, sounding bored. Besides, Loverboy already went to see the missus earlier this week, remember? Izuku knew it was none of his business, but the conversation he was eavesdropping on made no sense. He could understand that most of the people in the building, even if they were police, wouldn't know the particulars regarding the Nikaido case, but what relevance did Tsukaki going to see his wife earlier in the week have to do with anything? Although, why the detective apparently only saw her periodically by the sounds of it was almost more of a mystery. I dunno. The first officer weaseled, only 6 hours of quality time? Instead of the usual 2 days. Doesn't sound like an equal trade if you ask me. At that point, Izuku prudently chose to extract his attention from the conversation. Prying into the private life of the man who'd so graciously given him a chance was no way to show appreciation. It was thanks to Tsukaki he'd been given an opportunity to study his accursed quirk in a relatively safe environment and learn how to harness it for the betterment of society. He owed it to the man to at least keep out of his personal affairs. Izuku Madraya? The unexpected call of a somewhat familiar-looking female officer snapped the green-haired necromancer from his musings. As the young woman approached, the hero in training didn't fail to notice how her eyes never left Tae. Yes, Izuku replied, managing to hold in his usual stuttering. The officer might have seemed okay, but the green-haired teen had no idea if she knew what had happened in the interrogation room or not and if he could be in trouble for it. The fact he refused to put a leash, literally speaking, on Tae could have also set off some of the more wary officers as well. Detective Tsukaki has instructed me to give you a tour of the station, the officer announced, finally taking her eyes off Tae. Apparently whatever he's involved with at the moment will take more time than originally expected and he didn't want you to waste your time just sitting here. Izuku sighed in relief. He wasn't in trouble. Now standing at ease, the female officer flicked her gaze back to the older of the two zombie girls as she waited for the detective's in turn to respond. She really didn't want to do this. Hell. If she'd been told the undead would be roaming the precinct that day she would have called in sick or used what little PTO she'd scrounge up to avoid them. It had been months since she'd last seen the young necromancer and the blood-covered Ravna he'd brought back from the dead. But somehow the walking corpse hadn't rotted away a bit. How could a dead girl look healthier than her? Still, scuttlebutt held that the boy was the reason there'd been a major break in a collection of murder cases recently. Surely the kid couldn't be that bad, if the rumors were true, right? Neither Izuku nor the policewoman knew it. But at that moment, thanks to the green-haired necromancer's quirk, Ikaruga was spilling her guts to an increasingly satisfied Tsukaki. His first rather simple question had had the pink head explaining the nature of her illicitly hidden quirk. The assassin had revealed the Yakuza corpses she'd been concealing and a sizable amount of highly illegal weapons and ammunitions without issue. Now the once haughty Trinity Raven couldn't even shed a silent tear as she was forced to reveal the names and locations of every employer and provider she'd ever come into contact with while the detective wrote every word down. Belatedly realizing he'd gotten lost in his own head again when he'd realized he wasn't being scolded, Izuku snapped to attention and nodded at the still waiting officer standing before him. A tour of the station sounded perfect. As the green-haired teen followed the nervous female officer along with his two partners, he was completely unaware of the medal Tsukaki was now planning on recommending him for. Or the all-you-can-eat buffet visit the detective would insist on paying for in the future. Late evening, Midoriya residence, sunset. After a long day at the Mujudafu police station, Izuku and the now 3 undead he oversaw managed to return to the green-haired teen's home without incident. This was due in part to the discovery that Saki could pass as a member of the living for the time being after she'd been given a plain tracksuit by the police force to wear. Besides raising the blonde, delinquent and bringing down the Trinity Raven, the rest of the young necromancer's day had passed by fairly smoothly. There'd been a crash course on office procedure, the protocols of which Izuku had found laughably easy to follow. There'd been an intensive lesson on why heroes should never treat paperwork and filing a case as easy or boring, which he'd readily agreed with. There'd even been a rather interesting lecture on human rights and why heroes going all out on villains should be discouraged. Well, that last one had been given by the police chief of Hazu, Kenji Tsurugami, who'd been visiting for a Q&A panel. The dog-faced man's words would have had more impact if he hadn't been smiling as he'd said them. Mentioning how Interpol complimented Mujutafu's department for handing over packages in acceptable condition didn't help either. The highlight of the day had definitely been watching as Ikaruga was dragged away by agents of said international organization, loudly begging to become his slave instead of facing her sentence. Izuku had shivered when he later been told of what the pinkette was to face, being sent to the villainously obscure and indefinitely detained, heavy environmental last-line prison. It was a fate so terrible even the dark web hesitated to speak of it. Void Hell Prison was rumored to be terrible, worse than even Tartarus, and could apparently break even the most hardened of villains just by name alone, never mind being sent to it. There were still whispers that the UN's public special prison could be broken out of, but those who were sent to Void Hell never returned. And were never heard from again either. Other than that event, watching grown men and women gush over Lily, even knowing of her state of existence, had been a heartwarming sight for the green-haired teen. The littlest zombie had received so many head pats from the officers that she'd seemed supercharged into a hyperactive state of being afterwards. Conversely, everyone had avoided Tay at all cost. Which, all things considered, was probably for the best. Well, I guess there's been worse first days, Izuku said, opening the door to the Midoriya family's home. I'm home. The green-haired teen had always dreamed of one day saying the traditional phrase, to someone other than his mother. Recently, that dream had matured into including Tsuda as the first person he'd see upon returning from a hard day's work. Although, with the both of them hopefully becoming pro-heroes one day, the reality would probably be much more complicated. Oh well. It took Izuku a full second to realize his beloved froggy girlfriend was standing in front of him at that very moment. Tsu-chan? Izuku stuttered, overcome with shock, joy, and for some reason, worry. Too late, he realized the frog girl's eyes weren't even focused on him, but someone else. Someone behind him. I can explain? Izuku deadpanned, too panicked to even express emotion at the moment. Welcome home, Tsuda said flatly, returning her blank gaze to the green-haired teen. Please do. Izuku felt a chill run down his spine. The Trinity Raven had nothing on his girlfriend. Wow. Saki chuckled, smirking at the scene unfurling before her. The blonde zombie decided to have some fun. It served the greenbin right for bringing her back as a fucking servant. Now that's a super controlling by slap. The delinquent's crass humor was interrupted as Tay slapped the back of the blonde's head, yet again, instinctually protecting her master from any and everything she could. This is Saki Nikaido, Izuku began, planning on sharing as much as he was allowed with his girlfriend. I know how it looks, but she's actually dead just like Tay and Lily-chan. Later. It took 20 minutes of panicked trembling, but by the end Izuku had managed to explain most of the situation with Saki to Tsu. He'd covered the blonde's backstory, the reason she was risen, and most importantly, the reason she was being kept around for at least a month. It turned out that Interpol would be sending an agent at some point to take a final statement and picture before dispensing some sort of compensation for their failure in protecting the Nikaido family. Of course, Izuku left out any mention of gunshot wounds or interrogations. He especially left out how good it had felt to use his quirk on an unwilling Ikaruga. In much the same way, he knew his mother had received an even further watered-down version of the day from Tsukaki. the detective choosing to put emphasis more on the green-haired teen's near-perfect handling of paperwork and case filing than his crash course in interrogation practices. "I understand," Sue said suddenly, lightly squishing the small frog plush in her hands. "I'm sorry for getting upset, Karo." While that wasn't the word Izuku would have used, the green-haired teen could see where his girlfriend was coming from. He'd arrived home, later than he said he'd be, accompanied by what appeared to be a normal, pretty girl their age. If their roles had been reversed, the young necromancer was sure he'd have reacted much worse. During the explaining, the group had moved to Izuku's room, and he and Sue had somehow ended up sitting on his bed. The two were so close they could feel the other's body heat, and as the hero in training gazed into wide, froggy eyes, he could tell his Tsuchan needed a hug. It went without saying that the door to the room was open. Both Inko and Baru were having tea in the living room, close enough they could hear anything happening in the rest of the apartment at all times. On top of that, with the zombie girls also in the room, the green duo found the thought of going any farther than hugs and kisses completely embarrassing and pretty much impossible. So, Izuku trailed off, trying to find a way to break the awkward silence that had fallen between himself and Sue. Stealing his resolve, the green-haired teen dug deep and found the courage to wrap an arm around his beloved girlfriend's shoulder. "What do you think of my room?" "Nailed it." Sue easily read the attempt at shifting the mood for what it was, and did her best to show her appreciation and enjoyment of the attention she was receiving. Without reservation, the froggy teen leaned against her boyfriend, laying her head on his shoulder. It was moments like these that the amphibious young woman was grateful Izuku didn't seem to idolize having a completely rock-hard body like many boys his age. "I like it," Sue replied, dropping her frog plush on the bed's pillow. Gathering her own courage, the frog girl placed her hands over Izuku's, threading their fingers together. "It reflects you perfectly. It's balanced, not too clinical or sentimental, Karo." Izuku felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He'd been terrified of showing his room to the beautiful frog girl since they'd become official, afraid that she'd find the medical memorabilia off-putting or the presence of the plushies a turn-off. "You're very kind and caring, Izuku," Sue added, a sudden feeling of hot static crackling from the two's joined hands and shooting to her stomach. A hazy idea began to form in the amphibious teen's mind. "You've got a heart of gold and you're really intelligent too. Honestly, I really don't want to share you with anyone else, Karo." The familiar feeling of prickling behind his eyes clued Izuku in that he was about to cry, not that the warm, fuzzy swelling in his chest hadn't already given him a hint. He'd only ever felt this happy around his Tsuchan. It was something the green-haired teen would never get tired of. "And you know, even though my family's always valued traits such as intelligence over conventionally desirable physical appearances," Sue said, pausing as she came to a decision. She couldn't ignore the heat any longer. Slowly, the frog girl guided her boyfriend's hand, the one that had been draped over her shoulder, to her chest. "There are times when we enjoy the physical as well, Karo." Instantly, Izuku felt his face catch fire and his heart race. His blood was literally singing in his veins. None of that helped him decide on what to do. The green-haired teen now had a hand comfortably resting on his beautiful girlfriend's breast, the covered mound of flesh ample and soft, and yet, his brain was short-circuiting. A part of him wanted to squeeze, a primal part that roared for him to do even more that very second. Another part cried out for him to flee and escape the situation before they were caught and he was branded a pervert. An incredibly small part was mature enough to advise him to enjoy the situation as it came, but to not push farther until the two had a chance to talk about it. In the end, the frazzled hero in training settled on locking eyes with the bold frog girl. "Love you," Izuku squeaked out, immediately coughing through the embarrassing vocal tic. The adorable blush that bloomed across his girlfriend's face did much to comfort the fumbling green-haired teen. "I mean, I love you, Tsuchan. I love everything about you." With Tay lying on the floor, silently munching on the head of her All Might plush, and Lily quietly braiding the hair of her fluffy unicorn. There was no one readily available to disturb the verdant couple from falling into their very own second of eternity. The stares the two shared turned flirty, as did the smiles. After a minute of basking in the love radiating from each other, Izuku and Tsu closed the distance and connected lips. The kissing started off slow, sweet, and innocent. Inevitably, passion leaked out, and as simple kissing turned to making out, Izuku began to gently knead the breast in his hand while Tsu slowly inched her own hand up his leg. The frog girl gasped as she felt, "What is the fucking meaning of this?" The vulgar screech was accompanied by Saki's entrance, the blonde skidding into Izuku's room at a full run. Naked. "Why are they fucking disappearing?" Saki continued shouting, pointing at several spots on her nude form, apparently unbothered by her state of undress. "Where the fuck are my badges of honor going?" What? What are you talking about?" Izuku shouted right back, completely confused by what was going on. The green-haired teen might have had more luck understanding had Tsu not been doing her best to cover his eyes with her hands. This was not the outcome the frog girl had hoped for after she'd sat through at least 10 declarations of the delinquent swearing that she didn't find Izuku the least a bit attractive. When the blonde had requested permission to take a shower, the amphibious teen had been all too happy when Inko had shown a loud mouth where the bathroom was. She knew the two Madrya probably felt for the rebellious zombie girl. Imagining Saki felt horrible for being dead and still having to go through a debriefing and an autopsy, and that was fine. Admirable even. But Tsu had been afraid of something like this happening. "I'm not one of you perfect fucking dolls, damn it." Saki continued to rage, flailing her arms around. "I'm me. You better not lay a fucking finger on the scar my first boyfriend gave me." That last shout actually stunned everyone in the room. Then, like a homely saint, Inko appeared, silently grabbing the rebellious zombie girl by the ear and dragging her away kicking and screaming. The woman marched down the hall with not a little anger visible on her face, although whether this was due to the blonde's choice of words or the fact that she'd interrupted the verdant couple, none could tell. "Are you two alright?" Karo, Baru asked, suddenly stepping into the room. The frog woman's face was twisted in obvious concern. "Was there violence?" "We're fine," Tsu replied, content in knowing that even if her cinnamon roll had suffered a heart attack, it wouldn't have really threatened his health. "Just a little startled, Karo." In truth, what really worried Izuku was Baru's appearance in his room. He was still hugging the fearsome woman's daughter, and in fact had only moments ago been groping her. The green-haired teen began to panic when the frog woman began to look around, analyzing everything she could see. He grew especially nervous when her eyes landed on one of his bookshelves. "Do you actually understand this?" Karo, Baru asked, picking up a published dissertation on advanced neurology. Izuku really didn't know how to explain that. Wednesday, Ministry of Justice. In a truly massive building of wood-paneled halls and resonant courtrooms, Izuku and his zombie girls sat waiting in a special holding room. None of the group had ever had cause to step foot in the labyrinthine structure before, but today was the day of a trial especially close to the green-haired teen's heart. It was the day of the trial that would bring justice to Izuku's littlest and cutest assistant, Lily. "How are you feeling, Masao?" Takeo asked, his large frame squeezed into the chair next to his child. By some miracle, the mountainous man had managed to regain enough of his composure to be allowed to enter the Ministry of Justice. "Lee, I don't like these clothes," Lily replied, pouting. The normally bubbly zombie child had been forced to dress in drab boy clothes for the day, and was openly unhappy. The brunette hated that she died before being old enough to file the paperwork that would officially make her a girl in the eyes of the law. "I don't look cute at all." The past few days had been gloriously relaxing for the boy with the cursed blood, if you could call intensive police training relaxing. The green-haired teen had danced through paperwork lessons and protocol rundowns like they were already second nature to him. He'd stood in during evidence compilation a number of times at various crime scenes, even aiding in the discovery of a hidden clue in one case using his advanced deduction skills. He'd even been promised a walkthrough of how to handle a forensics kit tomorrow. The surprise crash course in self-defense had been an unexpected blessing. Structured lessons had allowed the green-haired teen to come up with new ideas on how to combat villains and capture criminals more efficiently. Surprisingly, Lily had come to be quite happy as well. The littlest zombie had been loved by pretty much the whole station, and had taken a liking to watching the tech team as they toiled away. When the brunette had showed signs of being skilled at computer work, she'd cited how she'd always watched her pappy when he'd worked, becoming curious about the technology early on in life. According to the officers, Lily was a natural when it came to handling databases, networks, and even search engine software. "Don't worry, it'll only be for today," Takeo reassured, taking a moment to re-examine his own uncomfortable garb. The formal suit the large man wore was nothing like the slacks he normally dressed in. And remember, no idle speech either. Normal talking today. I know, Lily grumbled, sounding extremely dejected. Nothing cute today at all. Seeing that his precious child was miserable, Takeo reached for any idea that could hopefully lift Misao's spirits. "Don't be sad," the scarred father said, putting on his best smile. "How about some ice cream after all this is over?" Though the smile had no effect on the littlest zombie, Takeo did have a reason to be happy. Before leaving the police station on Saturday, Izuku had heard the news too, and by Sunday it had become public knowledge, causing a massive uproar. A circle of the rich elite had been arrested after caught committing acts of pedophilia en masse. When she'd heard the descriptions of those taken into custody, Lily had confirmed that the men who'd abused her were among those caught. There were, of course, other factors that made this case different than past cases where the rich and powerful were arrested and then let go with a slap to the wrist. This time the bastards had been caught red-handed, and recorded on video, by a multitude of witnesses, namely the anti-riot unit that had busted into their party room, weapons drawn, and the high-profile reporter that had somehow known to hide away in a closet and film them in action. The greasy old men and slimy younger men had been found groping and undressing kidnapped children, all from the local area, after a spokesman had given a toast to the group. The men had cheered to the tune of once again having evaded the law and succeeded in enjoying their privilege with no limits. Denials of such were impossible when the reporter revealed herself and offered her camera's footage to the arresting officers on the spot. The video evidence was sickening, but its existence was oh so satisfying to those who knew how slippery the entitled could be. With evidence piling up to the magnitude of an avalanche, all the bastards involved had their assets immediately frozen, law enforcement citing the use of which would have made their suspects flight risks. A little-known prior ruling by the Ministry of Justice decades ago additionally put these assets up for confiscation pending the result of the trial, a bit of righteous compensation to families affected by a criminal's actions. Effectively, a guilty verdict would leave the monsters arrested homeless and without a penny to their names. The normally loyal, albeit sleazy, lawyers who represented the group of bastards had also bailed out immediately, citing no prior knowledge of their clients' illicit activities and an unwillingness to tarnish the names of their firms by representing such filth. Buru Asui had publicly scoffed at such a declaration, and had stated the more likely cause of the abandonment was to avoid friendly fire. The frog woman had then offhandedly stated in another interview that she would suggest a thorough audit of the firms regardless. All of this meant a great many things for Lily, not the least of which was the ability to move about without fear of encountering the bastards again. However, there was still a bit of a legal issue surrounding the brunette. "Sir, while I don't oppose such an outing, I must remind you that..." Izuku trailed off, failing to find a gentle enough way to explain to the enormous father that he couldn't just let Lily run around on her own. He'd been appointed her handler, just as he had with Tae. Due to Lily's feral episode, and the extensive report Izuku had submitted clarifying why he believed it had happened, the QRA had deemed any zombie created by the green-haired teen's quirk as potentially dangerous. with the only other options being letting the agency take the undead away or putting them down. The hero in training had earned the title of official handler, and had been ordered to supervise his creatures at all times, as if he were handling some type of feral animal. "I know," Takeo barked, his hatred for the boy who'd enslaved his sweet Misao peeking through. It galled the man that the same teen was, by law, allowed to sleep in the same room as his baby. "Don't expect any ice cream from me though. Pappy. Izuna doesn't have to comply to your demands, you know." Lily snapped at her father. "He's being nice enough to let you take me out, so don't be mean to him. I can still say no to your request." The group fell silent as the littlest zombie put her foot down, both metaphorically and literally. It was a great example to those who were in the know of how the brunette was beginning to stand up for herself. Being taken under the wing of the Asui woman and having the situation with her father explained to her probably had something to do with that. The room's door suddenly opened, and a couple of police officers Izuku had met at the Mujurafu precinct over the last few days entered. The green-haired teen was thankful for small miracles. "It's time," one of the officers announced, earning understanding nods from Izuku and Lily. Takeo huffed, remaining seated as his little Misao walked away. As he was still classified as emotionally unstable, he'd been barred from the courtroom. Saki, true to her reputation as a delinquent, scoffed and slouched further in her chair before the urge to follow her new boss became too strong. The blonde had nothing to do with the case currently on trial, so she'd been told to come along, but stay in the gallery as an observer. Tay, completely silent, rose and accompanied her master, his shadow as always. It was agreed upon by those in charge, with a word from Buru as well, that attempts to separate her from Izuku would be the worst choice anyone could make. Ministry of Justice, Courtroom for Jewels. Ikigo Go, second wife of renowned scientist Takeo Go, was not a happy woman. When her freak of a stepchild's corpse hadn't been cremated as she'd ordered, she'd only thought something had gone wrong with her plans. When she hadn't been able to get a hold of Takeo, since destroying the fool with the news of his child's suicide, she'd known she was going to have it rough. When she'd tried to book a flight out of Japan, only to get arrested while packing her things, she'd realized she was in real trouble. A whole year's work, gone to waste, and she had no idea what had happened. The job had hardly sounded difficult on the surface, just a simple espionage request from a client who'd wanted to get their hands on the most recent research data of one Takeo Go. The approach had followed Ikigo's usual modus operandi. She'd casually gotten to know her target, had become his closest confidant, and then had seduced him. When she'd learned of Go's dead wife, and the brat he still had that was in dire need of a mother figure, she'd believed she'd struck gold. It had only taken 4 months of dating after her first seduction for Ikigo to believe she'd gotten her target in her pocket, although that hadn't been enough to grant her access to his data. By that point she'd realized how sentimental the oaf was, and had decided marrying him might be enough to give her limited access to his research. She'd been right. However, the files she'd needed had turned out to be encrypted as well as secured on Go's laptop, special software rendering the data untransferable. Once she'd discovered that, Ikigo had hatched her final plan. Keeping tabs on Go's cross-dressing freak of a child as she had been, Ikigo had known that the brat was striking gold in the idol industry at the time, manipulating her fool of a husband into traveling overseas for one last experiment before retiring to become Misao's manager had been child's play. She'd even managed to convince Misao to agree to Go's trip, citing the extra money brought in would prevent financial hardships as his career took off as Lily Hoshikawa. After Go had left, the rest was simple. She'd sold Misao to a contact of hers for some extra cash, and when the animals he'd then been gifted to had ended up strangling the freak as she'd known they would, she'd used her rights as stepmother to demand immediate cremation before anyone would have had a chance to claim foul play. Immediately after doing so, she'd called Go, laying into the man and blaming him for his precious baby committing suicide. Knowing the inconsolable scientist would likely follow his child into death, Ikigo had been all set to leave the country with her husband's work in hand. She'd already been dreaming of the payout too. An early retirement maybe? Spending obscene amounts of money on anything her heart desired? The possibilities were endless. Well, they had been. Now Ichigo found herself sitting before the most feared judge in Japan, anxiously waiting for the prosecution's surprise witness to arrive and place the final nail in her coffin. Her entire plan had been deconstructed in minutes, with evidence, and she couldn't imagine who could make her situation any worse. Although, the woman that stared at her so dispassionately from the bench didn't appear to need much more to do so. Hanabi Hyuga, known most recently as the final judge, sat and glared at the piece of trash, barely keeping itself from cowering. The charges against it, and the evidence shown, had been monstrous to be sure, and unforgivably cruel beyond doubt. The slightly graying woman itched to use her quirk, Eye of Truth, on the bitch for even now standing by a non-guilty plea, but she knew she couldn't, not yet. Her quirk, as powerful as it was, had always been heavily restricted, the higher-ups in the government not wanting her ability's single hour of use to be wasted. They despised going a month with her out of commission nowadays, unless it was a result of taking on the most heinous of villains or the most scandalous of crimes. And somehow, that list had come to include the case of one Ichigo goes. I've heard enough to send this person behind bars for the rest of their natural life, Hanabi stated, strong voice echoing throughout the courtroom. The disgust and contempt she clearly felt for the filth before her likewise echoed. Ichigo had the decency to flinch. However, the circumstances of this final witness are such that I feel justice would not be properly served until we've all heard what they have to say. Crushing silence pervaded the courtroom, all attending holding their breath in anticipation. Trials attended by the final judge were always historic, not the least of which being because while the rulings involved usually rocked society, they were also always forbidden from being recorded by the media. Everyone knew Hanabi Hyuga had a quirk that had something to do with the ultimate revelation of truth, but no one knew how it worked. The Ministry of Justice worked tirelessly to keep it that way too. Officials feared showing the quirk's mechanics to the public would give criminals or even lawyers ideas on how to evade it. This effort in reasoning, however, certainly didn't stop unscrupulous reporters from attempting to sneak in cameras. Those that were successful were given incredibly harsh sentences afterwards, even if so far they'd never managed to direct their hidden recorders toward the final judge herself. Even with the knowledge in mind, a certain reporter of dubious morals was even now sitting in the gallery with hidden camera at the ready. She was going to film the new arrival, find out what was going on, and sell this scandalous trial to the highest bidding station for more than she'd ever dreamed of. For the first time in the history of this honorable court, Hanabi began, hesitating as she steeled herself for what was about to happen. The murder victim themselves will be called to testify. Murmuring exploded. A cry or two of shock cracked through the air. Confusion prevailed. Ichigo nearly had a heart attack. Within minutes, half the courtroom was sure the final judge had misread the docket while the other half jumped straight to the only sane conclusion, which was that little Miss Algo had actually survived and was now ready to testify. Ichigo knew differently than either camp though, having had to make sure the freak was completely dead before sending him to be cremated. For her part, Hanabi felt a slight nervousness for a completely different reason than the now rowdy courtroom she was presided over. She was about to use her quirk, and when she did, she'd be shown the truth. When someone described an event to her with her quirk activated, she would see the events themselves as they happened. Whether or not she was told the complete happenings or biased remembering, she would always see what actually occurred, her viewpoint completely objective. It once made her the best prosecutor in Japan. It now made her the best judge. But besides the month-long cool-down period, her quirk also put her under a massive amount of mental strain. Knowing that any minute she would be watching the final moments of Miss Algo eat away at Hanabi's sanity. Observing atrocities she could do nothing to stop had always affected her, but when children were involved it always seemed worse. The giant double doors to the courtroom opened, and silence once more reigned supreme. A pair of officers in full uniform appeared, escorting 3 teens. Between the trio followed a child. 2 unanimous thoughts crossed the minds of those lucky few sitting in the gallery at that moment. The first was that the child, surely Izuku, didn't look dead. The other was, why were 3 random teenagers suddenly involved? Izuku's heart was a hair's breadth from completely stopping. By the grace of some black magic fuckery, Masao was right there, walking to the witness stand. Doing her best to hide her panic, the woman began to look around. If she couldn't escape, was there anything she could do to stop the freak from getting her sent to Tartarus? It was at times like these that Izuku cursed her parents for birthing a daughter whose quirk was only the ability to handlessly unbutton. Well, buttons. Called to testify on behalf of the prosecution, Izuku. In mandatory attendance, her handler, Izuku Midoriya. The prosecutor's proclamation sent the courtroom into another whispering fit. Izuku led Lily through the shifting crowd, wishing that the Asui matriarch could have been there. Unfortunately, due to their closeness, Baru had felt it better she remain on the sidelines. As the green-haired teen marched toward the witness stand with his partners, Saki grumpily seating herself in the back of the gallery, the whispers of the crowd grew louder. At the same time, the woman being judged became even more restless, and the imposing judge, watching it all, appeared to gaze down on them all with a look of sadness. "Before we begin," Hanabi called as Lily hopped into the witness's seat, "Midoriya-san, I would appreciate asking you a few questions as well." Izuku took conscious control of his blood again, ordering it to devour anything his body produced that might exacerbate his anxiety. Even then, he could only just respond coherently, "Of course, Your Honor," Izuku replied, glad he could manage to do so without stuttering. Fortunately, none in attendance noticed as his eyes changed from emeralds to rubies. "I'll answer everything to the best of my abilities." Hanabi nodded, riffling through the papers littering her bench. Soon enough, she found the files pertaining to her witness, and the quirk that had been used to bring him back to life to testify. Honestly, it creeped her out. First of all, and most importantly, Hanabi began, reading over the information in front of her a dozen times in quick succession, but unable to process it to her liking. Is the victim, Izuku, fully capable of answering questions relating to the events of his zombification? As one, those in the gallery paled at the words spoken. Izuku nodded to Lily, now wordlessly sitting at the witness stand. Izuku stared intently at the court officer positioned next to her, or more specifically, the security strap keeping his gun holstered at his side. "I can, Your Honor," Lily replied, showcasing her full cognizance and control of her actions. "I also remember everything from when I was alive. And how I died." A handful of attendees stepped out of the courtroom, racing to the nearest trash cans as they fought the urge to vomit. Hanabi visibly suppressed a wince at the words. The safety strap at the court officer's hip came undone. "I see," Hanabi said, swallowing hard. There were many questions she wished she could ask now, especially those relating to the morality of turning a child into an undead creature. However, the stamp of the QRA on the documents, the bastards, stopped her. "Midoriya-san, why are you described as the handler of these people?" If it were only the Ravnet beside Midoriya, Hanabi would have had no problem describing the undead the green-haired teen had raised as creatures. Watching as Masao squirmed in his seat though, and taking his previous answer into account, it was clear the child had his own free will. And labeling a clearly sentient child a creature would have been inhuman of her. The empty eyes of the other zombie girl were too unsettling to ignore though. Izuku nodded, sighing in resignation. He knew he'd have to explain the unfortunate circumstances of his quirk's control aspect, and why his partners could go feral outside of his presence. One day, he just hoped it wouldn't have had to be so public. Well, there was no bang. Lily's head snapped back, a bullet tearing through her cheek and exploding out the back of her skull. Izuku made her move. The now crazed woman had decided she wouldn't let a freak of a child take her down. In sheer desperation, she used her quirk, stealing the pistol of the court officer guarding her. Taking aim at the brunette who was seconds away from ruining her life for good, she readily pulled the trigger. She'd take another murder charge over being connected to those bastards slated for Tartarus. She knew she wouldn't survive long if they were tied together. It happened too quickly for most to react. Bang. 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 In seconds, Izuku had unloaded almost an entire clip into the chest of her target. Then, she turned and aimed at the final judge. Bang. Izuku stumbled to the ground, the hero in training having jumped in front of the flinching Hanabi. Instantly, Tay was on the gun-toting woman. Before she could blink, the Rathed had grabbed her by the arm holding the gun and snapped it like a twig. Once dead eyes now blazing in absolute hatred, the oldest zombie girl pulled with all her might, and ripped the limb from her master's assailant. Wham! Izuku's blood-curdling scream was cut off as the enraged zombie girl smacked her with her own dismembered limb. Trying to compose herself, Hanabi Hyuga stared in disbelieving shock at the two young citizens who'd been killed on her watch, right in front of her. A boiling anger began to build within the normally stoic woman's chest, and she raggedly pulled in a lungful of air to shout for security when Unyai-chan Masago popped up from where he'd been slumped against his seat. In the blink of an eye, the child had run to the fallen form of the one he'd called Big Brother. To the growing horror of the older woman, the brunette did all of this with a chest full of bullets. Ugh! Hanabi's horror only intensified as the green-haired teen who'd saved her life grunted as he stood up. "I'm fine." Izuku groaned before retching. Mixed in with bloody vomit pinged a single bullet. "But I'm beginning to hate when that happens." The surreality of watching a teen who'd just taken a bullet stand as if nothing had happened was almost too much. The fact that quirks gave many members of the populace increased durability, the only thing keeping many of the remaining attendees from breaking. Many heroes were bulletproof after all. And it wasn't like the bullet had hit the green-haired boy in the head. Right? Tay. Stop that already. Izuku shouted at his first partner. The Rathed promptly ceased her rampage, even dropping the limb she'd been using as a club to beat the woman who'd hurt her master. As if a switch had been flipped, the zombie girl fell into place at the green-haired teen's side, looking as innocent and harmless as ever. Izuku was exceedingly grateful as he looked around that none of this was being recorded. There was no way his mother would handle this well if she knew any of it happened. From her seat in the gallery, Saki Nikaido looked at the green bean, who, for all intents and purposes, was her master now, and began to change her opinion of him. Chaos seemed to follow the nerd, so maybe she'd actually find some fun following him. The reporter who'd succeeded in sneaking in a hidden camera couldn't believe her luck. She'd just struck more gold than she'd ever expected. If she sold this, the pandemonium it would cause would raise her paycheck through the roof. Hell was about to break loose in central Japan, and the green-haired necromancer would be at the center of it all. Magnus, please don't tell me I have to name all the references I make. The Zero Observant 3, and please tell me if you're going to leave criticism, you're at least planning on leaving something constructive like advice on how we can improve as well. Also remember, perspective will influence character description in this story. Chapter 20 is Sinister Fallout. The normally explosive blonde known as Katsuki Bakugo stared at the young woman who'd become his roommate just a week ago with a look bubbling, if barely muted, aggravation. If the two had originally met under more normal circumstances, that is not forced to room together in an institution of all places, the bomber had come to accept he'd have probably never given the spider girl a second glance. And it wasn't that he found her appearance frightening or some bullshit reason like that, no, what pissed him off was the Sylvette's self-perceived greatness. After all, he was the best. And if he'd never heard of someone before, not even rumors, then they must have not ever been too important. Right? Who, again? Bakugo rumbled the words, deriving a spark of amusement from watching the Sylvette fume at his continued questioning. Antagonizing his newest roommate had gotten to be almost a habit by this point, although the practice did have its drawbacks. like being unable to keep from setting the spider girl off in the mess hall during breakfast, for example. In her seat sitting across from her, irksome roommate, Junko Kanno fumed. "Junko Kanno, damn it." The infuriated shout was accompanied by the arachne-esque teen slamming her fists down onto the two's shared table. In the fading echo of the strike's thunderous boom, the scratching of scythe blades skittering across the linoleum floor could be faintly heard as Kanno's arachnoid limbs twitched under her restrained anger. "I was the #1 idol of Japan and you know it. Stop being a Neanderthal this instant." The female arachnator wiped what definitely weren't tears from her eyes as she felt her rage cool as quickly as it had come. She refused to accept the reality she was being presented with. She knew what her powder keg of a roommate was doing, but still. The idea that she'd been forgotten by the public so quickly was excruciating to her soul. It hadn't even been 6 months since her fall from grace. "I get that you were supposedly an idol, Legs, but I'm telling you. No one remembers you," Bakugo said, punctuating his point as he played with his food using the insult to silverware that was the plastic spork. The abomination was the only type of eating utensil the staff gave out during meal times. "Lily Hoshikawa. That's the only idol I've heard of recently. Stupid old hag and her shitty TV shows." Even with his zero interest in the floundering idol industry, Bakugo was sure he would have remembered an idol of high enough caliber to be proclaimed as the best in Japan. The Sylvette now pouting across from him? She definitely hadn't rung any bells, and still didn't even now. "The child idol? That's who you're comparing me to?" Kanno nearly shrieked. The skittering sounds picked up again, clearly indicating the arachne-esque teen's continuously building stress. To look at her, it would seem the Sylvette was ready to deck the blonde sitting across from her at any second, choice of limb pending. "And why were you looking at child idols anyway? Holy fuck, are you a Lilicon?" Bakugo's response was immediate and no less violent than should have been expected. "I am not a Lilicon," the blonde drawled, slamming his own hands onto the two's table and jumping to his feet. The mistreated furniture creaked and groaned from its sudden and unrelenting mistreatment. Acting on instinct, which was to always lash out, Bakugo pointed an accusing finger at his roommate and spoke again. "You're just a delusional wannabe who can't accept the fact that she never made it as big as she thought." This colorful confrontation was the day's end result of the two confrontational teens acting as each other's therapeutic listener once again. Neither Bakugo nor Kanno had been getting anywhere meaningful with the institution's staff of therapists since they'd arrived, and in response the director had decided to task the two with hearing each other out instead. This was how the blonde had come to learn of the Sylvette's tragic past. Flashback: Siriata Institution, Room 214. "This idea is shit," Bakugo had spat, slouched against the wall his bunk rested against. Why had Bokemino even suggested this? He'd already been here for a few days and the spider girl hadn't said a peep since he'd arrived. Even now, the Sylvette that he'd been told to call Junko Kanno had refused to say even a word to him. Instead, she had spent all of her time looking out their shared window at the ocean beyond with cold, empty ice-blue eyes. After getting bored of non-stop silence, even the normally standoffish bomber had begun to itch for conversation. "Come on, Legs," Bakugo had eventually barked, tossing his pillow at his uncooperative roommate's head. Faster than his eyes had been able to follow, one of the Sylvette's extra arachnoid limbs had snapped out and speared the feather-filled cushion through. Kanno herself hadn't even turned away from the window. The blonde had only been able to gape at the move. Soon enough, however, the bomber's more normal, comfortable anger came rushing back. The fuck was that for? That was mine. In the blink of an eye, Kanno had seemed to snap, turning and skittering toward him. Before he could react, the Sylvette had boxed Bakugo in by surrounding him with her spider legs. "Then you should not have thrown it at me." The words had been said with such a calm, almost soft voice. It had been completely different from how Bakugo had been used to dealing with those of the female gender, his mother being his only real experience. This unexpected turn had caused the blonde's brain to sputter for a moment. When he'd snapped out of it, the bomber had been too late to realize Kano had already retaken her spot by the window. Finally, Bakugo had shouted, immediately noticing his roommate tense. Brushing off how easily the Sylphet had cornered him, the explosive blonde had pushed himself to his feet, unwilling to let the little bit of progress he'd made slip away. He might have thought Bokemono's idea was idiotic, but he honestly had nothing better to do at the moment. And he'd known the giant would ask him if he'd even tried later. So spill legs. It's not like I really care or anything, but what the fuck did you do to wind up here? Even facing away from him, Bakugo had been able to tell that Kano had struggled not to answer him. It appeared that breaking her silence even once had weakened her will to remain so. Strategic mind finally fully engaged into his task, the blonde quickly decided to go with a tried-and-true method to get what he wanted when force wasn't an option. Pestering. Some would call it bullying, but weak shits like that didn't matter anyway. Right? Come on. Just spit it out already and save us both the trouble, Bakugo had continued to press. What was so bad that I existed? That voice that had sounded so soft only moments ago rasped as it had reached a limit any listener could have realized it hardly ever pressed. Bakugo had flinched at the volume, instinctively ducking his head for an instant through sheer muscle memory. Staring wide-eyed at the now panting Sylphet, the blonde had leaned back, confused but satisfied he'd actually gotten somewhere. I doubt that legs, Bakugo had snarked. They don't throw people in places like this for just being born. Why don't you try pulling the other fucking one, and start from the beginning and make some goddamn sense now that you seem to be so chatty? Kano's face had twitched at his words, a scowl quickly hidden behind her blank mask. But for all her effort, the Sylphet hadn't been able to hide the internal struggle that had been visible if one had looked into her eyes. Not that he had been, of course. The spider girl had just been incredibly easy to read once the blonde had gotten a good look at her face. With a long, drawn-out sigh, Kano had eventually shifted her position by the window. The new placement had allowed the Arachne-esque teen to side-eye her roommate while still easily being able to glance out the window if she chose. With slumped shoulders, Kano had taken one last, shaky breath. I was born in Kyushu, to a middle-class family of no real importance. The Arachne had begun, almost immediately fiddling with her fingers she had clasped in front of her. Around them, fuck. I was shit out right here in Mujutafu, Bakugo had interrupted with a snort, unable to resist. Again, how the fuck did a country girl like you end up in this shithole? A pillow, of his own, to the face had been the Sylphet's immediate response. Growling, the bomber had thrown the offending cushion off, glaring daggers at the perpetrator. Had there been the smallest of smirks on the spider girl's face for a split second? Are you going to listen or not? Kano had asked after a moment of silence. Bakugo had only huffed and folded his arms with a scowl. Having seen her roommate's response, the Arachne had miraculously decided to continue. As I was saying, around my 4th birthday my quirk manifested for the first time. Bakugo's brows had furrowed at that. Mutant quirks, like Kano's, should have been active since birth, the physical attributes of them anyway. Seeing her roommate's confusion, the Sylphet had let out a hollow laugh. This, the spider girl had said, gesturing to her arachnoid lower body, is not the result of my quirk alone. For some reason, that admittance had set a sense of foreboding in Bakugo's gut. However, by this point the blonde had come too far to pussy out of hearing his roommate's story in its entirety. My quirk was actually an emitter type. Originally, Kano said, moving on with her story with a wistful sigh. I could produce a silk-typed substance for my body that could be woven into a thread that was literally 10 times stronger than a majority of the textiles even the major support companies could produce. At the time he hadn't reacted, but Bakugo had been slightly impressed at the information. While it hadn't been able to compare to his own quirk, Kano's ability to create such a material, if not an exaggeration, had the potential to have every hero support company in the world interested in her. Hell, as the future #1 hero, Even he had been interested in the prospect of a suit that could keep up with his awesomeness. But it hadn't been enough for me. Kano's sudden words snapped the blonde from his thoughts. The spider girl's fidgeting hands were now clenched into fists. Before I'd even turned 5, I'd fallen in love with the idea of becoming an idol. I was completely obsessed. I was going to be the one who captured the heart of the world. No matter what. Now that Bakugo had been able to appreciate the idea of idols may have been stupid, not even equal to the crappiest of heroes in his opinion, but that fearless, unconquerable drive the bomber had seen in his roommate's eyes had been something to see. And then it had snuffed itself out. But I quickly realized I had a problem, Kano said, a sharpness edging into her voice. I may not have lacked in charisma or charm, but when puberty decided to hit me early, it came with another curse in addition to the one I'd expected. 2 of the Sylvette's arachnoid limbs had snaked out from under her at that point, maneuvering to arch outward like a pair of featherless wings. Bakugo had focused on his roommate's actions, and not the image her words could have otherwise engendered. These 2 sprouted from my lower back one night. With no warning, Kano had explained, curling one of the limbs inward and running a gentle finger along its exoskeleton. I nearly had a heart attack. Having any mutant features would have immediately ended my aspirations. I had to think quickly. Bakugo had been unable to look away at the almost tender way Kano had caressed one of her arachnoid limbs. The blonde's breath had abruptly caught when he'd seen scars running down the width of the limb's patella. Luckily, I had a stroke of genius before I went too far, Kano had eventually said, having side-eyed her unusually quiet roommate and witnessing the blonde stare openly at what remained of her scars. Hopefully, one day, a molting would erase at least that mistake from her life. I ended up thinking of using my silk to craft a pair of angel wing-like coverings for my new additions. The Sylvette had sighed again, looking out the window at the view that had filled her days since she'd arrived at the institute. A look of sheer longing had crossed her face then. Bakugo, suddenly impatient, had not so subtly coughed to regain her attention. This time, the irritated look had gone unheeded. He'd met it with one of his own. Every outfit I made from that day forward had my wings included in them, a disguise hidden in plain sight, Kano said, returning her gaze to the window's view. My angelic appearance must have pressed some special buttons, because suddenly I was exploding onto the modeling scene within a few weeks. Modeling? Bakugo had begun to get aggravated as soon as the sense of foreboding in his stomach had lessened. Leg's story had been alright to start with, but to the blonde it had appeared as if the Sylvette had begun to go off on a tangent. And then, my chance of a lifetime, Kano had continued, seemingly unaware of her roommate's growing frustration. The spider girl's ice blue eyes had glazed then, seeing only memories. I was invited to participate in a regional idol contest. Bakugo had rolled his eyes. I won by a landslide, Kano had said, only the faintest traces of smugness present, only nostalgia remaining. That victory is how I met the biggest idol producers in Japan. And I Mizuno. That had rung a bell with Bakugo, but he hadn't been able to remember why at the time. It had only added to his growing frustration, and the blonde had nearly missed the almost venomous way the Sylvette had spat the other girl's name. At the time, she was just another idol hopeful that had won the contest from another region, Kano had explained, tone returned to neutral. The 2 of us and 4 others were to be part of a plan by the producers to create a band of top idols to revive the industry. A wistful, almost melancholy look had fallen upon the Sylvette's face at that moment, as she had gazed out at the ocean beyond. Bakugo, who'd only minutes ago been nearly pinned by the spider girl, was weirded out that his roommate could vacillate between emotions so quickly. One of the things he'd always prided himself on was having crushed his weaker emotions long ago. Only those like his stalwart confidence and comforting rage had been allowed to remain. Only the most powerful, for the best hero. The producers ran into an unexpected problem, however, Kano had continued, completely ignoring the fact that Bakugo had almost slipped away into his own thoughts. Our prodigal group could only sit one leader. Of course, of the 6 of us gathered, only myself was fit for the position. But Mizuno didn't see it that way. The explosive blonde had snorted, silently nodding along. It hadn't been hard to see that Legs thought highly of herself, once one had gotten through her mask of indifference and reached the fire below. The bomber had felt a strange sense of camaraderie with the Sylvette then. He'd known exactly how it felt to know your place was at the top yet have others constantly getting in your way. We argued extensively about the leadership position, Kano had further said, hands once again fidgeting together with a sense of vaguely remembered frustration. Our quarrels led to the group's debut being delayed 3 whole days. That uninspiring little tramp insisted I hand over my wings if I wanted her to step aside, as a sign of good faith, she put it. But that would have been unacceptable. Bakugo had really starting to dislike this Mizuno chick, well, more than he disliked most people in general anyway. Of course, if Legs hadn't squashed her competition immediately in the first place then that had to mean either the Sylvette wasn't as big as she thought she'd been, or the bitch was actually the better idol. And deserved the position after all. In a rare moment of objectivity, the explosive blonde had decided to reserve judgment until and if he ever met this other idol. Honestly, he really didn't care. Honestly. Eventually we agreed to a compromise, Kano had admitted after having taken in her roommate's slowly devolving facial expressions and completely misreading them. I kept my wings, and my secret, and the leadership of the group would to be set on a rotation between Mizuno and I. The listening bomber had scowled all the more at that information. The best didn't give in. The best didn't negotiate with their enemies. The best kicked ass and stood above their competition no matter what. The best blazed a trail of victory through every battle that came their way. The best weren't locked away like a crazy. Bakugo had to forcibly pull his mind away from that suddenly spiraling line of thinking. Gritting his teeth, the blonde had snapped his head to the side, in no way trying to hide how shameful his unheroic thoughts had been. Believing her audience's actions indicated their loss of interest in her story, Kano had skipped straight to the night when her nightmare had begun. There was a party afterward, the Sylvette had said, relaxing only slightly when her roommate hadn't seemed to ignore her words. Mizuno invited me personally. She said she wanted to bridge the gap that had grown between us, and work out our differences away from prying eyes. Bakugo's head had snapped back up so sharply it nearly popped. Had Legs really walked into such an obvious trap? Maybe he'd overestimated the Spider Girl's intelligence if she hadn't been able to see what her rival had been setting up. It hadn't been like his own situation, where Romero had somehow gotten to the faculty of unturned them all against him. The bomber hated all that subterfuge shit with a passion for a reason. It was only after I arrived that I discovered the party's main attraction, Kano had whispered while wrapping her arms around herself. And if I'd known, I swear I would have never had gone. An explosive blonde eyebrow had risen at such a declaration. What kind of shit had Legs' stupidity dragged her into? Alcohol? Strippers? There was Trigger. Bakugo would forever deny the shiver that had crawled up his spine at the mention of the illicit drug. It had only been in that following instant however that the blonde had realized just what kind of deep shit his roommate had been led into. Even prime hero material, like himself, had known that you didn't mess with Trigger at all. The street drug was infamous for its multitude of side effects, and its prevalence of users who were villains. Even being caught in the same room as the stuff was usually a one-way ticket onto a watch list for the rest of your life, and instant death to any aspirations you had as well. No one, on the up and up at least, did business with a person if they were connected to Trigger in any way. Ever. It had happened so fast, Kano had whimpered, the memory almost as painful as the original experience. Mizuno had stepped away to get us drinks, and the next thing I knew a stranger had grabbed me and pinned me against a wall. Bakugo had grit his teeth for a whole new reason than before at that. He might have had issues with the old hag, but she bashed some things into his head hard enough to stick. The mental image of some tweaked-out shooter taking advantage of a girl while high had pissed him right the fuck off. But that hadn't been the worst of it. Not by a long shot. Another came forward, Kano had forced out, falling deeper into her trauma, eyes wild. He stuck me with a needle. I thought I was going to die. Oh, or worse. It's shameful, but I be blacked out right after. Sometimes. I think it might have been better if I'd never woken up. The explosive blonde had shot off his bed right then, molten wrath rocketing him forward. But before Bakugo could even growl out a word, however, raging crimson had met breaking ice. Instantly, white-hot fury had seemed to extinguish to embers. The whiplash of emotion had stumbled the bomber, and he'd frozen in place inches from a wide-eyed and shocked Kano. Don't ever say that. Bakugo had spat each word out like the explosions he'd used to toss around like free candy. Shit like that is the worst. I'll admit, I don't know you legs, but you don't seem like the kind of punk-ass bitch who'd off themselves just because a couple of shooters got loot. Slap. I woke up a freak you vulgar oaf. The slap had been somewhat expected, but the tears following the shout had made the explosive blonde uncomfortable for some reason. Why, he hadn't been able to say. And before the bomber could think more on it, his roommate had pulled herself together enough to continue. The needle that man stuck me with was a dose of American Black, Springfield, Kano had said, shaking once more. I'm sure someone like you must have heard of it, right? A trigger strain so powerful its effects can actually remain permanently for the right user? Bakugo had only been able to nod at the rapid-fire words spilling from the silhouette in front of him. The longer she'd gone, the faster she'd spoken, vomiting up who knew how much pent-up frustration and anguish. The minute I woke up I realized my body had reacted intensively to the dosage I'd been given, Kano had said, speaking almost too fast to follow by the end. Drug-induced mutations are rare, it turns out, but when they occur they're oftentimes fatal whenever the initial catalyst would wear off. But in my case, it was permanent, wasn't it? Bakugo had said, voice low at the revelation. Kano had nodded, tears continuing to stain trails down her reddened cheeks. It was hell, the silhouette had whispered in return. The first thing my manager said to me when he called was that he was severing our contract immediately. He refused to work with someone who looked so hideous they couldn't even go out in public without causing a panic. And that wasn't all. Bakugo had stood, head down, eyes shadowed as he'd taken in the cruel fate of Junko Kano. The idol group's producers sent a text, spelling out my expulsion from their project, Kano continued, wiping a few tears away only to sob right after. Apparently word of my condition had already gone viral, and no one believed my innocence. A rising idol falling from grace after being caught using trigger, was a much more salacious story apparently. The bomber had only given a shallow nod, having figured that was likely what would happen. He'd learned well the bias of those who only wanted to believe in the exaggerated side of things. Even my family abandoned me, Kano had finally said, collapsing against the window, spent. I was a freak, a monster, and no daughter of my father's. He disowned me, before I could even set foot in my childhood home. Only hours after being released from the hospital I'd woken up in. Bakugo had felt his fingers twitch at the sight before him. The arachnator had looked so devastated, her spider limbs curled up and around her as she caved under the weight of her plight. She hadn't been able to look at him as she'd finished her story. I couldn't take it. Kano had hoarsely gotten out around her tears and shaking. I just broke down. The next thing I can remember clearly is waking up here, at Siriate, staring down at the wreck of a girl sprawled across her bed. Bakugo had felt something within him ignite. Leg's story, as annoyingly long as it had been like his own. They had both been headed to the top, both the best at what they did, and then, just like that, someone had taken it all away. It had been jarring for him, but as Bakugo had stood there, alone in his room with a girl he'd only known for a few days at the most, he'd felt the oddest sense of camaraderie. And like a spark on a stick of dynamite, the blonde bomber had had an epiphany, a plan to take it all back. Flashback end. Present day, Siriata Institution, Mess Hall. What? Kano's shriek snapped Gotsuki from his reminiscing, an annoying habit he picked up from Bokemino. Realizing he'd been standing like a goddamn fool, the blonde grouchily sat back down in his chair, ignoring the overly dramatic hurt his roommate was projecting due to being forgotten so easily like a little bitch. I don't want to hear that from a delusional buffoon who thinks fireworks and a sailor's tongue are the trademarks of a pro hero. Needless to say, after Junko had recovered from telling her story the next day, and basically guilt-tripped him into it, Katsuki had shared his own. Instead of showing any signs of sympathy, which the bomber would have hated anyway, the Sylvet had taken his words in, and almost immediately declared the blonde a foul-mouthed narcissist with delusions of grandeur. The second coming of All Might, she had assured him, he was not. Of course, she had been able to relate to the blonde's smoldering hatred for a certain Romero person that he had kept going on about. The creep sounded like a master manipulator, able to orchestrate events so that the bomber's entire life crumbled to ruin. He'd even managed to land him in a mental institution of all things. But the collateral damage the oaf had tried to brush off? That was concerning to the Sylvet. I will become the #1 hero. Bakugo raged, agitation boiling over as his faint amusement choked on his wounded pride. It'll take more than this to keep me down. The blonde slammed another fist into the shared table, ignoring the resulting groan in favor of leveling a judgmental glare at the arachnitor standing across from him. I'm not like you legs, Bakugo spat, crossing his arms completely unlike a petulant child. I don't give the fuck up at the first obstacle that comes my way. You know. If you really wanted that stupid fucking dream of yours, you just get OFF your ass and find another goddamn manager already. By this point, neither the blonde bomber nor the Arachne-esque Sylvet seemed to care any longer that they weren't alone in the mess hall. Not that blow-ups such as this hadn't happened before, far from it in fact. Since the second day the two had been put together, their time in public had become infamously punctuated with the downright apocalyptic arguments the two would get into. And just as with every other time one of these disagreements had come about, the other residents were left to cower away from the two, scared out of their minds. Each gave the combatants as much space as possible, unwilling to get between the two who looked ready to commit murder. You stupid, vulgar oaf! Kano screamed, sharp arachnoid limbs piercing the floor as if stabbing someone to death. The Sylvet gestured to her mutated lower extremities, and just who'd you imagine would want to sponsor this kind of body, huh? It's not like you're fucking ugly or anything legs, Bakugo roared back, no longer able to watch his words. So I'd say pretty much any damn asshole with a brain. Silence. The entire mess hall could hardly blink through the collective shock. Had the notorious, new resident of the Siriata Institute really just said that? What? Kano stammered, unable to believe her ears. Had she really just heard that? Had she really just heard the words that she'd been aching to hear since her life had become a waking nightmare? Instead of answering, Bakugo returned his attention to his rapidly cooling food, studiously ignoring the now pink-cheeked arachnitor, as she sputtered away. The bomber's shaggy hair, combined with his downturned look, did an adequate job of hiding the faint trace of red that was rebelliously heating his stone-set face. Hey, Kano managed to call out through her whirlwind of emotions, say that again. The explosive blonde tensed, his pride suddenly at war with an impulse that had only recently made itself known to him. That new part of himself wanted more than anything to say those words again, to see more of Leg's embarrassed expressions. Conversely, the knee-jerk reaction of his ego firmly stated that such behavior was only for the weak, like the extras he dealt with daily. In the ensuing silence, the massive television mounted into one of the mess hall's walls was finally able to be heard. And that's when it happened. Breaking news. Panic at the Ministry of Justice Wednesday as a defendant was able to acquire a firearm and open fire at the case's groundbreaking witness. Afterward, the accused even took aim at the world-famous final judge herself. The somber announcement made by the single-horned Ikaku Magi caused a horrified gasp to ripple through the mess hall. The reputation, fame, and more importantly public admiration of the final judge was thought to be absolute. To even consider a person to have shot at her, it was unthinkable. Thankfully, her honor is unharmed. Now, we were able to acquire footage of the attack, but I feel it my duty to give this warning first. The imagery you are about to see is unsettling. Viewer discretion is highly advised. The television screen cut to black before grainy footage filled the void. Right off the bat, the public of Japan was able to make out the nervous form a plain-faced teenager, the Verdainat standing beside the witness stand where a blue-haired child was fidgeting in. From the distance and resolution of the video, obviously illegally taken, it was hard to determine if the child on the stand was a boyish girl or a feminine boy. Romero. The hated name was mumbled lowly, clearly meant to be unheard. Unfortunately for the blonde bomber, his roommate had excellent hearing. The audience that had gathered by the mess hall's television was struck speechless as the low-quality video began to play, unleashing a scene straight out of a horror movie. Before their very eyes, cruel reality unfolded like the work of some sick fiction as the accused, a woman by all appearances, began to move. Due to the footage's dismal fidelity, to the watching audience it seemed as if one moment everything was normal, the next the accused had smoothly pickpocketed the guard who'd been standing next to her of his gun. Weapon in hand, the woman then turned to the young witness on the stand. Without a hint of hesitation, she opened fire. The intensity of the following scene made it hard to watch what happened next. From the edges of the screen, the other courtroom guards were visible, fumbling with their own gun security straps. Ultimately, they proved useless during the key seconds it took for the madwoman to slaughter the innocent child. Then, in a single breath, the rampage took on another focus. The gun-wielding accused turned the gun toward someone off-screen, presumably the final judge. She pulled the trigger. The green-haired teenager threw himself forward, straight into the path of the gunfire. In a spray of blood, he collapsed. Nearly instantaneously, a previously unseen body jumped into the fray, raven locks whipping through the air as she charged towards the armed madwoman. Before the stunned and horrified audience could even think to brace themselves, the new addition to the chaos had reached their target, and savagely ripped her arm off. Wham! Many a soul watching the news broadcast flinched as the agonized scream of the accused was cut off as her attacker brutally smashed her own severed limb over her head, with visible hatred burning through glowing red eyes. The beating was harsh and bloody, in no small part due to the gaping wound where the woman's arm used to be attached. The grainy video quivered, as if the recorder had been unable to contain the emotions that had run rampant through their body as they witnessed the carnage before them. Meanwhile, the mess hall was silent as a grave, many patients trying to digest what they'd just seen. Many more wondered why the video hadn't ceased playing yet, showing only the macabre beating as it continued. Wait a minute. Is he? The hesitant question died without answer as everybody still watching the illicit footage across the country took notice of the fact that the Verdainat who'd only just been shot was moving. Unyai-chan. To the ever-deepening horror of those watching, the child witness who they'd just seen murdered only moments ago popped up, looking only marginally nightmarish, doing so while riddled with bullet holes. Rushing to the twitching green-haired teen who'd also been supposedly murdered, the blue-haired child gently laid a hand on his shoulder as he pushed himself to his knees. And then retched a bloody mix of bile and metal. Beginning to hate when that happens. The Verdainat's words were only faintly audible over the cacophony of shouts from the court guards and screaming from the gallery. But it was clear to anyone able to still watch when the teen stood up, he appeared none the worse for wear. That is, if one could ignore the trail of blood coming from his head that had no visible wound to speak of. Stop that already. Mutterings and murmurs of every nature broke out, as the miraculously standing green-haired teen barked a simple command and instantly halted the savage Rathed in her tracks. The enraged young woman visibly switched gears, dashing to the Rathed side. The video shook and cut to black, the recorder obviously having been jostled too much by the others in the gallery to continue. Daikaku Magi returned to the television screen, pale-faced, and only barely suppressing his body's instinctual trembling. That was Romero? Kano asked with a hiss, icy blue eyes wide with fear and shock. The Arachnator had just seen two people shot dead, on television, and then they weren't. She couldn't process that information. As all of you tuning in just witnessed, the final judge was targeted but saved due to the intervention of a citizen. However, while the efforts of the young man in question were without a doubt heroic, demands have already been made for his immediate detainment due to the nature of his quirk being called too dangerous. Mr. Magi spoke calmly, despite his appearance. The man's somber attitude made it abundantly clear to faithful viewers that there was more to be said. Instead of immediately starting, the man took a moment to gather himself further, shuffling the papers on his desk mechanically. Bakugo didn't need some middle-aged old fart to tell him any more though. He'd already known of the existence of the monster they'd all just witnessed. It sickened the blonde bomber that the abominable freak had somehow weaseled his way into gaining license to raise another walking corpse. And this one had been a child for fuck's sake. Finally, Mr. Magi ceased to fidget and stared directly into the camera. The nation stared back. According to reports, and our own station's investigation, it appears there are many facts about Izuku Midoriya that should raise concerns. For example, his quirk was recently reclassified as cursed blood. Sinister name aside, actual recorded capabilities were said to include. The report cut off as Mr. Magi suddenly sat up straighter, a look of confusion crossing his lined face as he put a hand up to his right ear. The calm facade the aged newscaster had only just recovered slowly broke as concern and frustration began to overtake him. What do you mean we're being taken off the air? We haven't done anything. The station went dark. A moment later, a commercial for all-natural melatonin came on. Those watching could only blink in shock. One of Japan's most known newscasters had just been shut down completely by the government. And in mere moments. Although, many weren't actually too surprised once they thought about it. While airing images and video of the final judge had never been officially outlawed, unless given authorization, such actions had historically been heavily penalized. So, if that really was the Romero you spoke of, Kano began, catching the startled glare of her roommate. How exactly do you intend to bring him down for what he did to you? The Arachnator's question was in no way sardonic in nature. The Sylvette truly wished to hear her roommate's plan of attack. She couldn't fathom how anyone could hope to defeat someone that defied nature to such an ungodly scale. Bakugo himself could only stare back at his roommate's icy blue eyes in shocked silence. Romero had taken a shot to the head, the blonde had seen it. That meant the freak had died. Except he hadn't. Or if he had, he didn't stay dead. That bullet had done lethal damage, dealt to a part of the human body so vital a single scratch could render even the strongest heroes crippled. And Romero had just taken it and stood right back up. How? Bakugo felt the uncomfortable fingers of uncertainty attempting to curl their way up his spine. He'd learned the hard way that taking down his monstrous nemesis without consequences would be no easy task. At the moment the blonde could only think of one way to do so, without the freak's manipulations getting in the way. The two of them had to be standing on opposite sides. Since he had no plans to ever turn villain, that meant Romero would have to do so. But as much as Bakugo hated to admit it, he knew the freak wouldn't ever admit to his true nature by choice or be held accountable for the things he'd done. Not without a fight. And now the blonde's head was beginning to hurt. But the bomber wasn't the only one in pain at the moment. Redacted, Aizawa residence. Sprawled out on his old, torn-up couch, Shouta Aizawa could only suffer and wince as he went through another wave of what could only be described as the most extremely acute case of hangover known to man mixed with severe withdrawal. What was worse, was that he knew the exact cause of his current torment, and couldn't find it in himself to hate it. At long last, the miraculous blood that had saved him from the brink of death, fixed his body to its peak condition, and given him more energy than he'd known what to do with, was dying out inside him. Even so, that didn't stop the nice ancient quirk from filling him with the overwhelming desire to go and assist his problem child of a student as soon as the news broadcasts he'd been watching had cut out. Gotta help. Aizawa slurred, his entire body protesting as he tried to push off the couch. Incidentally, the gruff man managed to accomplish only half of his endeavor, end up falling to the floor as soon as his center of mass left the cushions he'd been resting on. It was only as now that Aizawa cursed his past stupidity regarding his diet during the last few days. He'd known that he'd had to be able to get up and ready to go soon, but at the same time he'd been afraid of giving in to the mental itch that had cropped up in his thoughts lately regarding obtaining more of his problem child's blood, regardless of whether he needed it or not. In the end he'd allowed himself to wind up as he was now to avoid falling to the temptation. Thankfully, as his withdrawal progressed, the itch for Midraya's blood seemed to be lessening. He still wished he could reach out and help the young necromancer though, and offer any aid he could. Unfortunately, said necromancer was undergoing far more difficult tribulations than his homeroom teacher knew. Same time, Mujutafu General Hospital. Where is Inko Midraya? The panicked shout might have startled the receptionist at Mujutafu's largest medical center, had the experienced woman not foreseen such an entrance by the woman in question's son the moment she'd been rushed in. 39 years had given her plenty of acumen when it came to her hospital's patients and their families. What she hadn't expected was for the teenager to be followed by 3 girls, each with vastly different hair colors. Izuku Midraya had been spending his last day as an intern at Mujutafu's police station learning a few of the less intensive skills of the peacekeepers he'd so far been unable to make time for. Gathering forensic evidence and memorizing the steps taken to preserve a crime scene had seemed like well-deserved cake after the fiasco 2 days prior. When all had been said and done, he'd been awarded 2 medals after the trial. The first was to commemorate his service to the country of Japan for his part in taking down the notorious Trinity Raven, her capture leading to the identification of over 24 of the assassin's contractors. The second was presented to him for protecting the final judge without regard for his own life. The green-haired teen had no way of knowing what was being announced during a certain news broadcast right at that moment. The basement of the station hadn't had a working television in over a decade. By the same measure, he had no way of knowing that his own mother would be watching said news broadcast. It had been well into noontime before he'd get released from his lessons and leave the station's basement, his phone instantly blaring as it finally re-established signal. "Where is Inko Midraya?" Izuku shouted again, looking around frantically in utter desperation. Wild emotions ruined any chance the hero in training had at remaining calm or thinking rationally. Baru hadn't said much when her call had finally made its way through to him. All the green-haired teen knew was that his mother had been working at the Asui household, even though it had been both matriarchs' days off. Apparently the mothers had been chatting over a cup of tea when the news report came on. Both women had been horrified at the gruesome footage of their favorite green-haired boy being mercilessly shot in the head. As it turned out, it had been too much for Inko to take. Too much for her heart to stand. "Calm down, boss." Saki tried to sound fierce, but the rebellious zombie girl could tell through her link to the Verdainef that his despair was nigh all-consuming. The blonde's attempt might have had more effect if her own voice hadn't wobbled pitifully as she spoke. The welling emotion and unforeseen side effect of learning what having a real mother was like only for her to be put in life-threatening danger, soon afterwards. "Izuku-kun," Baru called out as the frog woman came into the green-haired teen's vision. "There you are, Karo." In less than 10 minutes, the situation was explained to a breaking Izuku. For 10 agonizing minutes the hero in training had to listen to how his mother had suffered first a panic attack, and then collapsed. It took every one of those 10 minutes for Izuku to fully comprehend that his mother, the larger-than-life woman who'd loved him and been there for him since the day he was born, was now barely clinging to life. Inko Midoriya had suffered a severe heart attack. The years of watching helplessly as her baby boy suffered the daily trauma of being bullied had finally caught up to the Midoriya matriarch, the media airing his partial murder for its sensationalism the straw to the camel's back. The green-haired mother had bottled her emotions for so long, it had become almost second nature for her to repress herself. Until it was too late. Incidentally, the medical staff had shortly been able to draw a correlation between Inko's condition and her quirk's recent and sudden spikes in power. Unfortunately, no one had ever stopped to consider how her ability might impact her body, a dire oversight what with quirks historically being likened to a person's muscle. Now, they were all paying the price. For Buru Asui's part, her conscience weighed her down doubly so. The frog woman had known what had transpired that day in the courtroom. In an effort to spare her new friend and fellow mother the distress she herself had felt when she'd been briefed, she'd decided to withhold the knowledge from Inko. The imposing woman's eldest daughter, on the other hand, was a particular kind of frustrated at the moment. With her father at work and her mother having taken her boyfriend's mother to the hospital, Asui had been left at her home to care for Samadera and Satsuki. That didn't stop the frog girl from swearing to herself that she'd chew both her Izuku and mother out for hiding the events of the courtroom from her as soon as she could. I need to use the restroom, Izuku suddenly announced, unable to remain seated by the small group that had coalesced around him in the hospital's waiting room. The presence of his girlfriend's guilt-ridden mother and 3 zombie girls made the Verdanet abruptly feel claustrophobic. None spoke out to stop him. None questioned him. It was clear to all that the teen needed to release the emotions that were oiling inside of him. Personally, the hero in training wanted to get as much crying out of the way right then as possible so as not to worry his mother any further when she woke up. As the Verdanet left the room, only Tay accompanied him out of those present. Buru felt it both wasn't her place and she had no right to. Lily felt through the bond that there was nothing she could do for her big brother at the moment. Saki knew that her new boss wouldn't want someone standing there to watch him bawl his eyes out, not to mention she was shit at sentimental crap anyway. Mujurafu General Hospital, restroom, in the otherwise empty chamber of porcelain thrones, Izuku repeatedly splashed the coldest water the sink in front of him could dispense onto his face. If he held his breath, the green-haired teen could almost fool himself into believing the droplets that trailed down his cheeks were the frigid spawn of the streaming faucet. Guilt gnawed at him, chipping away at his soul from all fronts. It taunted him with his mother's condition, spitefully decrying his every heroic effort in the name of justice as culminating in just more suffering for his beloved family. It criticized his stupidity, for being unable to think quickly enough to act differently. It decried his stubbornness, painting his acceptance that he'd do it all again regardless of the knowledge of what would come after, as selfish. And when he even tried to consider what would have happened if he hadn't acted at all, it called him a coward, a fake hero. The worst part was that Izuku knew what would happen now, his accelerated thoughts having churned through scenarios since the day of the trial. He would be branded for what happened. Sure, he'd protected the final judge, but that would account for Ben's when it came to light that Tay and Lily were undead under his control. Varying levels of autonomy aside, he'd be prosecuted as a slaver, the addition of Saki no doubt worsening that outcome's severity. In the end, while the broadcast had been cut short, the Verdanet knew that the report would be leaked to the public soon enough, if it hadn't been already. And now he'd be blamed for his mother's health as well. Which was only fair. Her condition was his fault. What should I do? The empty bathroom hardly carried the question's echo, but the words hadn't been meant for anyone in particular. Izuku knew something had to be done, but the what eluded him. He couldn't focus, too much of his brain's power was being spent on worrying about his mother. The hero in training couldn't even think up possible options to choose from on how to proceed. Why couldn't he think of an heal? What? Izuku's shocked scream was an entire 2 octaves higher than his previous record. The Verdana could have cared less at that moment. His heart pounded. Besides Tei's stalwart presence, he should have been alone. Heal. The words repeating allowed Izuku to recognize their source, and when he did, horror unlike anything he'd ever experienced before flooded his system, clutching him in an icy grip. The words were said in his voice. That wasn't quite right though. It was as if it both was and wasn't him. The words had carried with no emotion, only cold logic, directly to him. In fact, had he really heard anything at all, or had he merely felt the impression of the words in his mind? Wide-eyed, Izuku jerked back upright, hoping to use the reflection of the mirror to see if anyone had snuck in without him noticing. Instantly, the green-haired teen felt his breath catch in his throat. His eyes were glowing. Staring back at Izuku from the mirror was an image of himself, but not. A shining vermilion gaze he'd never seen before bore into him, impossible to read. Who are you? Izuku asked, subtly positioning himself into the beginnings of a defensive stance. With his current problems, the Verdana refused to even hazard a guess as to what to expect from this development. Better to be prepared. I am. Thou art. I. The him with the burning gaze stared back, the words crashing against Izuku's brain like tumbling boulders. The green-haired hero in training felt a weight come crushing down upon him as he came to a heart-stopping realization. The him that wasn't gave a shallow nod, still unblinking. Izuku swallowed heavily. This figure. This phantasm. It could have only been one thing. He'd first felt it during the attack on the USJ, when he'd been unable to act. It had taken the reins then, and pushed him past his limits. There was no doubt in his mind. This was that sinister force that lived inside him. He was talking to his quirk, his own cursed blood. What do you want? Izuku asked, abruptly feeling a rod of steel insert itself into his back. If he was going to face the force of nature that had upturned his entire life and made his existence a struggle by its very definition, then he was going to face it head-on. He refused to cower in this moment. A million thoughts and ideas ran through the Verdana's mind as he waited for an answer. While rare, sentient quirks had been recorded since the dawn of the New Age, and mixed into those accounts laid a number of nightmarish tales of parasitic ones that evidently overwrote the will of their host. Izuku suppressed a shudder when another realization came upon him. His blood could demand anything from him. It wasn't like he could easily refuse. Briefly, the terrifying thought that the microorganisms he harbored wished to spread themselves across the entire world entered his head. What is thy desire? That was not what Izuku had expected. Of all the demands, of all the possibilities, it had to be the most baffling of them all that confronted him. Did this mean his quirk was safe? Had he truly just been overthinking the repercussions of using his blood and casting it as sinister in ignorance? Did he actually have a misunderstood blessing flowing through his veins? It couldn't be that simple. Could it? Can you fully restore my mother to full health? Izuku asked, hesitating once before adding, without control affecting her at all? It had been devastating when the green-haired teen had realized Su-chan had accidentally fallen under his blood sway. Life during the interim until the frog girl had flushed his quirk from her system had been an experience he never wanted to live through again. That was actually the reason Izuku had consciously avoided contact with Aizawa-sensei recently. Staying out of his homeroom teacher's presence would hopefully prevent the gruff man from suffering his blood's enthralling effects too harshly. But even the mere thought of enslaving his mother? It was almost too much to bear. There was another pause, as the reflection of the Verdana's quirk once again only stared at its host. Izuku felt his entire body tense in preparation for a worst-case answer. Perhaps he really couldn't use his blood without its curse? Yes, Izuku almost collapsed against the sink he'd come to grip almost unconsciously. A wave of trepidation and confusion suddenly flooded him instead of the relief he'd expected. If this reflection was to be believed, then it set off numerous questions about the nature of his accursed quirk. If he could save his mother, and who knew how many others, from life-threatening injuries or conditions without enslaving them, then why hadn't that been the case until now? The revelation that it might be a choice was so mind-blowing that Izuku almost slipped into shock. Up until that moment, he'd always held a dark theory that his blood's healing effect on others was only a byproduct, a result of the quirk's almost sentient desire to supply him, or itself, with more useful tools. However, that had always run counter to his own wish to simply helping others. The dichotomy had always been a frustrating aspect of his curse. But now it was plainly clear to see, the answer that had always eluded him. The true nature of his quirk was terrifyingly simple. For all its possible intelligence, for all its seemingly villainous intentions, his blood obeyed him above all else. So what did the enslavement of Tsuchan and Aizawa-sensei say about him? It was a thought that deepened a pit in Izuku's stomach that he'd always tried to ignore. But now the pit had become an encroaching abyss that threatened to Izuni. Lily's muffled voice snapped Izuku out of his spiraling musings. Inko Mama can get visits now. The green-haired teen nodded before realizing the littlest zombie girl couldn't see his response from outside the bathroom. Taking one last moment to himself, Izuku turned to look at his quirk's reflection one last time. The unsettling vermilion hadn't blinked once, and continued to stare back at him with the seriousness of the grave. A gentle, supportive hand slipped onto Izuku's shoulder, breaking the contest of wills. Tae gave a slow nod and grunt when her master turned to look at her. The hero in training didn't need their bond to understand the message. The Ravnet had somehow been aware of the situation, and she'd just given him her vote of confidence. It felt nice. Mujudafu General Hospital, Intensive Care Ward, Room 302. Inko Midoriya was not exaggerating when she said she was having a truly terrible day. Only hours ago the event she'd long feared had come to pass. She'd had to witness her baby boy being murdered before her very eyes. The fact that her son could shake off death like a dirty pair of clothes ultimately mattered little to her. The green-haired mother was of the firm belief that no parent should be forced to endure such a horrible sight. Just seeing her baby suffering, imaging the pain he'd felt when the bullet had struck his skull. It made her nauseous to even remember. And on top of that, Inko had no idea of whether or not her son's quirk could completely heal the brain, complicated organ that it was. What if Izuku had lost parts of his memory, or his personality? What if? Mom? The tentative call, quite enough to almost wither away in the air, was still enough to give the internally panicking mother the strength to focus herself. Inko's tired gaze was gratefully met with the sight of her precious baby boy as he entered her room. He looked to be in perfect health as always, standing tall and more importantly in one piece. More importantly, with his beautiful emerald eyes shimmering with unshed tears and his voice trembling with guilt as it was. The green-haired mother was put at ease that her baby was still himself after his latest ordeal. I'm so sorry, Mom," Izuku whispered, steps faltering as he closed the distance between the two and took his mother's hand. "I know I promised to never do it again, and I know I kept it a secret, but I just can't help it. I can't stand there and not try to save someone in need." Guilt of her own flooded Inko as she heard her son's heartfelt confession. She was sure of it now, a nagging fear that had only grown louder recently. Her fretting and overprotectiveness, her own insecurities, were only causing her baby more hurt. The green-haired mother had known better than anyone of her Izuku's heroic nature, just how selfless he was. Trying to keep him from acting on that very nature had been terrible of her, regardless of the fact that her intention had been to protect him from preying villains. The events of the trial highlighted the cruelty of reality for her. She couldn't be selfish any longer. As much as it pained her to admit, she couldn't hinder her baby's involvement and growth from here on out. Instead, she would have to fully accept his choices and support him on his quest to become one of the greatest heroes That's why. Izuku continued, tears finally cascading down his freckled cheeks. A watery smile beamed at Inko. That's exactly why I can't just stand here now and do nothing when I could be doing something to save you. Inko blinked rapidly, wrestling her remaining fatigue down as she fought to understand her son's words. As her mental fog dissipated, her doctor's words returned to her in a kaleidoscope of fragmented memories that boiled down to one finality. Until a compatible heart was found, her existence was reliant on the life support machines surrounding her. And even then, the surgery to implant the replacement organ was risky for someone at her age and condition. On top of those factors, even a successful transplant would necessitate therapy and medication that would remain daunting shadows over her future for the rest of her life. The green-haired woman also knew she'd need constant attention during her initial recovery. Attention that her son would selflessly volunteer, she was sure, even though that would sacrifice his dream to be a hero in the process. And that was unacceptable. Inko refused to cut the wings of her baby, she would rather, "Mom. I can heal you," Izuku announced, temporarily solid in determination before hesitancy at the idea returned, "but only if you allow me. If you trust me." Inko felt her battered heart swell. She understood, of course she did. How could she forget that her baby was closer to an angel than anyone gave him credit for? Izuku could perform miracles with his quirk, even if there were concerning side effects. And how could she not trust her own son? "Do it," Inko rasped, the act of speaking sapping her of what strength she'd recovered since waking. "I believe in you, Izuku." With consent given, the door to Inko's room swung open, revealing her son's 3 undead charges. The trio entered wordlessly, Saki and Tae positioning themselves to stand guard to prevent interruption, while Lily solemnly presented Izuku with the medkit once again. While dressing the girls in their hero costumes had been a spur-of-the-moment decision originally, the green-haired teen was grateful for his fortunate choice. Though Saki still lacked her own, the others wearing theirs meant Lily had had easy access to the tools he'd need to save his mother. Standing over his mother, syringe in hand, Izuku considered how to begin. His normal chant felt inadequate for what he wished to accomplish. There was also his blood's words to consider. According to the reflection, his quirk submitted to his wishes completely. So that presented the question, how did he go about communicating his desire precisely enough so that his mother didn't become entrapped by control but was still completely healed? After a somber moment of silence, and tens of ideas considered and discarded, Izuku believed he'd finally stitched together a compelling directive. "Oh, you who gifted me with life," Izuku began, tone descending into the level he'd used when chanting previously. At the edges of his consciousness, the green-haired teen felt a twitch shiver throughout his entire being. He hoped that the feeling was his blood coming to attention and heeding his words. "Who built my strength and hope through strife? Of one body, mind, and soul, I swear to you this chosen goal. In this hour, your time of need, I offer you this blessed creed, freely, do I my blood impart, to freely mend your tired heart." Inko hardly reacted at all when Izuku stuck himself with the empty syringe, extracting the needed amount of blood. The green-haired woman's entire focus was on her baby. How solemn and melancholic he appeared even as he worked to perform a miracle. Likewise, the homely woman barely felt it when her son injected her with the syringe's contents. It was an odd feeling, knowing her child's blood was flowing through her veins at that moment, traveling to her heart to repair life-threatening damage. It didn't feel unnatural at all, and no invasive sensation set her on edge like she might have expected. Instead, Inko felt strangely at peace. While the immediate fallout of the trial's illicit footage had now been handled, Izuku was unfortunately completely unaware of the unintended audience he'd procured. In the shadows, figuratively and literally, many an interested party was even at that moment examining the surprising oddity that was Izuku Midoriya. And as the video ended over and over again, many observers came to the same conclusion. Izuku Midoriya was a prize indeed. And soon enough, one way or another, His quirk, his very genetic makeup, would be theirs. Redacted, bar. Sequestered far from many searching eyes, the only two combatants who'd managed to escape the failed assault on the USJ facility could only stare at their ancient television set as they tried to digest the gruesome scene they'd just witnessed. The first to gather themselves immediately shot to his feet, the stool he'd been sitting on clattering to the ground. That's the brat who. But how? The lanky man, currently only wearing a single hand over his face, could hardly formulate a coherent sentence. His lithe body shook, a sign of his disintegrating self-control. The little shit that had blasted his face with the gun of all things had just stood up, in clear view for all to see, after being shot in the head while playing hero. The only reasonable conclusion the pale-haired young man could conceive of was that the brat had somehow found a way to use fucking cheat codes. But that didn't explain that monster of a girl who'd backed him up. "How brutal," commented the bartender, and only other occupant, of the establishment. The acidic yellow lights that functioned as eyes for the man whose body was otherwise a roiling black fog in a suit couldn't look away from the utterly savage beating the Rathed in question was giving the accused. And with her own severed arm no less. There is no possible way that woman survived such egregious injuries. When the video ended, their own recording of the original broadcast, the entire sequence of events was still burned into their minds. The younger of the two men suddenly slammed a fist onto the bar, rattling glassware. A wild look could be seen between the fingers of the hand covering his face. He'd just had a revelation. "That's it," the lanky villain hoarsely screamed. "That little shit must have been an S-level healer the whole fucking time. No wonder he could fuck up our operation like that." The man's compatriot internally hated moments like these, when his leader would equate everything to his video games. The boy needed to take these matters seriously. However, even the mist-based villain had to admit there was some validity to the analogy. A healing quirk of such stature could explain many of the inconsistencies they'd witnessed at the USJ, from Eraserhead's confounding and instantaneous recovery to the survival of the savage black-haired girl who'd been broken by Namu. It would even rationalize the impossibility of someone being unaffected by his leader's own devastating quirk. And, while a bullet to the head was normally fatal to even the greatest of natural regenerators, apparently the child in question possessed a quirk far stronger than any other ever recorded. The implications were endless, if that is true. A sinister voice rose from a static-filled monitor to the side of the bar, audio only, the only words discernible over the chaotic screen. "Then the heroes certainly shouldn't be allowed the honor of having him." The two villains in the room instantly snapped to attention, giving the monitor their complete focus. "Sensei," the lanky villain began, slightly wary, "what should we do about him then?" For half a minute, silence reigned throughout the bar. Neither villain dared to speak again before the voice from the monitor had a chance to answer. "For now, research," the voice commanded, though the words were no more harshly spoken than a suggestion. "The days to come will be hell on earth for that poor boy, I assure you. Let us ensure that, when the time is right, he is given the proper options to confront the public outcry that will soon dog his every step." The lanky villain grinned like a madman, his lips pulling hard enough to slip from underneath the hand covering his face. The prospect of adding such a powerful healer to his party made him excited. Conversely, the bartender gave no outward sign of a reaction, the elder villain knowing what the owner of the voice from the monitor was actually thinking at the moment. He was wary. A quirk as powerful as they'd just witnessed shouldn't have escaped his notice for so long. Historically, those with powers that could prove useful were ferreted out and brought to his attention before those who wielded them even reached their 10th birthday. And yet, somehow this boy had been a complete unknown. That meant one of two things. Either a third party was working to hide information from them, or the boy's quirk had started off much weaker and had actually evolved to the point it was currently at. Both possibilities were concerning. Shizuoka Prefecture, the Todoroki household. Chateau Todoroki had been having what passed as a family lunch, only his sister Fuyami and bastard of a father present. As usual, Between himself, the soft-spoken teacher, and the flame hero, there hadn't been much to talk about, so it had been silently agreed upon by the dysfunctional family to turn on the television. Immediately the news had blared on, delivering a breaking report about a certain green-haired necromancer protecting the final judge from life-threatening injuries. How did he do that? Fuyami asked in utter shock. Just like everyone else who'd watched the illicitly taken video, she'd seen plain as day the Verdanet survive a bullet to the head like it was nothing. Endeavor mulled over what he'd just seen in stalwart silence. He'd seen an untold amount of quirks over the years as a pro hero, and while others might not know it, abilities that could allow for the survival of such attacks weren't as uncommon as the public thought. However, those same abilities usually included noticeable activation or body modification, neither of which the green-haired runt on the television had displayed. Curious. I didn't think Midraya's regeneration extended to brain damage. Shido murmured to himself without thinking. Truthfully, the heterochromatic had been so focused on the video that he'd forgotten his sister and bastard father were still in the room. They, unfortunately, hadn't forgotten him. Wait! Fuyami shouted, whipping around to face her little brother. You know him? Quietly, Endeavor went back to eating his meal, covertly listening into his children's conversation. The brusque man, interested as he was, knew that if he attempted to ask his own questions, his rebellious son would clam up out of spite. Chateau hummed, still too engrossed in his own thoughts to consider his words. Oh, he's my classmate. Flicking his eyes to his sister, the heterochromatic belatedly realized the young woman wouldn't be satisfied by his short answer. Sighing, the dual-colored teen launched into the exploits of the young necromancer that he knew of, once again overlooking who else was present. Forgotten, Endeavor allowed his smile to turn wicked. He can do all that? Fuyami exclaimed. The young teacher was amazed that someone with that kind of power hadn't turned to villainy by now. She was sure she wouldn't know the first thing to do with a student like that. She wasn't even sure she was happy about her brother being classmates with the green-haired teen now. This, Midraya sounds most interesting, Endeavor said abruptly, finally speaking. The booming voice of their father startled the conversing children into instant silence. A quirk like that is far too powerful to ignore. At that moment, Chateau Todoroki realized he'd fucked up. Meanwhile, as he stood up from the table, meal finished, Endeavor allowed his thoughts to spin plans for the future. The green-haired boy was something else, a diamond in the rough of the weak masses. Such genetic potential as his should be put to good use immediately, not allowed to squander itself in the foolishness of youth. Walking away from his current masterpiece and first failure, Enji Todoroki contemplated how to proceed. It would have been preferable if this Midraya had been female. Breeding with Chateau would have no doubt given him a new, even better weapon to unseat All Might with little trouble. But, as things stood, the flame hero supposed his daughter would just have to give birth to a proper candidate for his masterpiece to mate with. Endeavor nodded to himself. Yes, that would be perfect. Then his blood would be in the offspring twice over, and its magnificence would be undeniable. Redacted, compound. Cast in silhouette by the television he watched, a lone man studiously took deep breaths to prevent himself from vomiting at what he'd just watched. The scene had been nightmarish, a confirmation of every fear he'd ever had since he was a child. Slowly, the deep breaths worked, and the shaking that had barely been suppressed quieted. Now still, the man took a further moment to center himself. It wouldn't do for his subordinates to see even a hint of weakness on his part. He knew that at least one wouldn't hesitate to take a chance at him if he did. Standing, the man swung his fur-shouldered jacket from the rack it had been placed on and put the garment on. Reaching over to his desk, he grabbed the lone item resting there and put it on as well. Mask in place, the man pulled out his phone with gloved hands. Over to his desk, he grabbed the lone item resting there and put it on as well. Mask in place, the man pulled out his phone with gloved hands. Crinistosis, meet me in the medical bay immediately, the man said, voice firm and unyielding. There was no trace of the panic that had nearly overtaken him only moments ago. The quirk disease has evolved. I just witnessed it bring an infected back to life. We need to step up our plans. The man took a single step forward before halting, a thought crossing his mind. And remember to bring Eri. Mujurafu General Hospital, Intensive Care Ward, Room 302. Izuku Midoriya was unaware of the fact, but at the moment, he was in more trouble than he could ever have imagined.